Glad to be here with my colleagues and my co-chair, Senator Harkins, to talk about important issues. And we were talking about this morning, that he and I spent a lot of time, along with the Lieutenant Governor, talking about our tax structure in Mississippi and talking about revenue sources and certainly the appropriations and how much all of that plays together. And I'm very thankful that I've got a finance chair with whom I can work closely, and we talk often about these two matters, because as most of you know, and anybody that's listening that doesn't know this, the revenues generated through the Finance Committee and the appropriations actually spends it. So we have to know, he and I have to know what's going on. I've got to know what he's doing to know how much money is going to be in the budget. He's got an idea about what we have to spend, what are critical needs in the state of Mississippi, so that he can help lead on fiscal policy as it relates to revenue. And we have been talking about this for a while, and I want to thank the Lieutenant Governor too for setting this up and naming you members here that are going to be able to talk about this and hear from some experts. I think there's a lot of talk out there about our tax structure, and I know Senator Harkins would echo this sentiment, that we want Mississippi to be the best and most efficient government in the state, in the United States of America. We want to have the best tax policy and the best spending procedures of any state in the country. And it obviously depends on who you are as to what you think is the best way to tax. Certainly there's got to be some taxes to help pay for things like education, roads and bridges, some healthcare safety nets, mental health, child protective services, Department of Public Safety, et cetera. But we want to make sure we've got the best structure that's economically sound and that puts us on the best foot to continue to recruit businesses, make sure we have good education results, make sure we have good roads and bridges. And so honored to be working with him today, and we look forward to getting some good information. So Senator Harkins, I'll flip it over to you for comments.
Thank you. Yeah, I echo pretty much everything Senator Hobson said. I think that this is an effort to establish somewhat of a baseline of facts to work off of. Revenue is always a moving target. We have historical reference to kind of lean on to see what the trends look like. And obviously we've got a collection of people who are going to testify today from our Legislative Budget Office, Department of Revenue, and the State Economist. And what I hope to glean from all this is just kind of give us a baseline of information, a set of facts of, where is our revenue coming from? What is it historically looking like in comparison to previous years, and maybe if there are any trends that are pertain to each source of revenue. And then also want to look at what we have coming down the road as far as our Legislative Budget Office giving some indications of some things that may be out there. Obviously, the Finance Committee, we don't get to have as many of the intimate meetings with the agency heads to know what is coming down the road and what issues that they're going to be facing in the coming years. So we want to make sure, and we've discussed in session and year after year, we talk about the things that are pressing, that, whether it's education funding, roads and bridges, our pension system, all these different things play into what we feel like we're going to be able to accomplish on tax policy. So it's important that we have a good set of facts to work off of, and everybody has a good understanding. And I know we got people watching online and participating via Zoom. So I hope that this meeting today and a subsequent meeting that we'll be having in the future will help to give us a good understanding of where we are, kind of a snapshot to work off of, and give you an opportunity to ask questions and maybe get a really good fundamental understanding of where we are and what we have to work with. So with that, I look forward to hearing from our presenters and listen to what they have to tell us. So with that, yeah. So first, we're going to have our Legislative Budget Office. Mr. McDevitt and Miss Ava Bliss will please, if y'all want to, y'all can sit at the table over here if y'all feel more comfortable. Yeah, you can come up there if that's a little more comfortable. Y'all can sit down and pull 2 mics up. And we'll hear from our Legislative Budget Office. Look forward to hearing y'all's presentation today. I think does everybody have a packet handout? Okay.
Good morning.
Is your green light on? Okay, good.
Green light.
All right, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for having us here this morning. As Chairman Harkins stated, I'm with the Legislative Budget Office. My name's Stephen McDevitt. I'm the Deputy Director. With me this morning, I have Ava Bliss, who is the Chief Revenue Officer for the Legislative Budget Office. And you all know Corbin Stanford, who is the Senate Budget Officer, works with us at the Legislative Budget Office. Cool. Having trouble hearing? Is that better? Okay. So this morning, we plan to talk to you about the budget process for the state of Mississippi. There's three distinct areas that we're going to talk to you about. The first is the actual budget process timeline, how that unfolds throughout the year. The second part will be the current budget for fiscal year 25, and then fiscal year 26 and considerations that we need to think about going forward into the future. And then the last part that we're going to talk to you about is going to be debt service and revenue. Looking at our first slide, slide 2, we're going to briefly describe a couple of the primary budget documents that the Legislative Budget Office prepares each year. At the top are the budget requests. These are the agency requests that get submitted in August of every year, with each agency's request for the next fiscal year. And we'll talk about these as we go through each one of the phases in the budget process. The next document is the 5-year strategic plan. This is where agencies actually lay out what they're intending to do and how they intend to use the appropriations that they receive to meet their target objectives. Those are due in July of each year. The next is the proposed budget. This is the JLBC recommendation. This is the legislative recommendation that is proposed each year in December. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail. And then the fourth document is the budget bulletin. This is the summary of the appropriations that occur after each legislative session. The Legislative Budget Office puts these together after the session and makes those available to the public. They're on our website. We'll go into we're going to actually go to slide number 4. So slide 4 is a timeline of the state's budget process. As you'll see, there's 3 distinct phases. There's a request phase that starts in June. During that period of time, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee will meet one time to hear agencies' request. That occurred on September 26th of this year. During the next phase, the recommendation phase, which starts in October, the JLBC will meet twice. They'll meet to adopt a joint revenue estimate, and then they will also meet again to propose the state's budget recommendation from the legislative perspective. And then in January is the appropriations process, which you're all very familiar with, begins in January. And again, we'll talk about this on the next few slides. All right, slide 5, the request phase of the budget process. Starting in June of every year, the Legislative Budget Office distributes budget forms to all state agencies. Now, this is an online process. Each agency logs in to their online budget request system and prepares the budget request that is going to be submitted to the Legislative Budget Office, and then we will compile it and take it to the Joint Legislative Budget Committee. From early June until August 1st, agencies work on preparing this information. It will include 3 years worth of fiscal year information. They'll give you your actuals for the past year. They'll give you your estimates for the current year, and then they'll give you their request for the next year. So for fiscal year 26 budget cycle, which we're in now, we will have FY24 actuals, FY25 estimates, and FY26 request. All right. During this period of time from June to August, the agencies also have to submit their 5-year strategic plans. Again, those strategic plans and their budget requests should complement each other. What they're requesting for in their plans should agree to what their actual budget request will look like when they're coming in. After August 1st, Elbow staff receives these requests and then they have to review these requests. So there's a lot of information that comes in and there's a lot of room for error and just a lot of need for quality check and control as agencies come in. They do a good job, but there's just a need for a secondary review before we actually publish these on our website. So Elbow has around 287 budget units. So the legislature each year adopts in excess of 100 appropriation bills. But those appropriation bills, from a budgetary perspective, are then broken down into smaller components. So if you look at the Department of Corrections, while they may come out as a single appropriation bill, they have multiple appropriation units. And so our staff is reviewing all 287 of those after they come in in August. Once the staff has approved the request and all the information looks to be entered correctly and the forms were filled out correctly, the staff will approve it in our online system and it will be published on our website and available for review. At the end of September.
Stephen, if I
Sure.
may stop you right here. And by the way, for committee members, if you have questions as we go through this and need to stop, just raise your hand or something so we can recognize you. But this is something that I get asked a lot is how do we know as legislators that we're looking at the best information that the agency has, and we're not just taking their word for it. And you were kind of alluding to that Elbow, our own budget office, takes a look at each agency and even what I would call the sub-agencies. For instance, I see Chris Graham, who I think is going to be presenting next within Department of Revenue. There's several what I would call sub-budgets within that. What are y'all doing at Elbow to ensure that we're getting the best information and make decisions that we need to make in that process?
Yes, sir.
And
So,
can you pull the mic a little bit closer too, so everybody can hear you well?
yes, sir.
Thanks.
So when the requests come in, our staff spends a bit of time reviewing this. Throughout the year, even before these requests come in, our staff is talking with the agencies and they're staying up to date on what's going on. So they kind of already know what was appropriated to the agency. And then they've been talking with agencies as needed up through this budget submission process to kind of have an idea of what they're planning to submit. So once the information comes in, our staff does a number of quality control checks. We have a checklist that we follow, and we're essentially ensuring that the information that comes in is consistent with what the state's accounting system presents for actual information. We're ensuring that what they're estimating for the current fiscal year actually agrees to what they were appropriated. We don't let them come in and say FY25 numbers are going to be in excess of what they're actually appropriated. So we're checking back against appropriation bills. And then for request, our staff spends a good bit of time questioning the information that they request. So there's a couple different parts of these budget requests, right? The information is sliced a bunch of different ways. And they'll take the number that was requested, say if they ask for an increase in headcount, they will go back and make sure that the information is adequately described in the narrative portion of the budget request. They will talk with the state personnel board if necessary to make sure that job classes are adequate, to make sure fringe rates are calculated properly, and before they're willing to approve this information. And if it's not correct, they'll reject it, send it back to the agencies and ask them to make appropriate corrections. And that happens periodically. That's kind of a backside of the process that isn't seen, but the staff communicates a good bit with the agencies throughout this process. And so a budget may be submitted and then rejected and resubmitted and rejected again until it gets to a point that we're comfortable that the information is accurate. All right. So after the Joint Legislative Budget Committee meets on the 26th, or when they meet on the 26th, they hold agency hearings. This past year, we had 5 agencies that presented to the committee. All those presentations are archived online and you can access them through Elbow's website. And during these hearings, the agencies actually took the request that they submitted on August 1st and presented it to the JLBC. After September ends, we move into the recommendation phase, which begins in October. This is where we currently are in our fiscal year 26 process. During this period of time, the staff at the Legislative Budget Office begins working through each one of the budgets to prepare a recommendation for the JLBC about what the legislative budget recommendation should look like. From October 1st until the JLBC meets in November, which this year is November 14th, the staff will work on these recommendations and they will present them to the JLBC during the meeting. Also during that meeting, the JLBC will have a joint meeting with the governor to adopt the joint revenue estimate for fiscal year 26. Once this meeting has taken place, the staff will then begin working on the direction they've received from the JLBC to prepare for the next meeting, which will happen in December of each year. In December, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee meets to actually adopt the state budget recommendation. All right, this year's meeting is on December the 11th. After this meeting and the recommendation has been adopted, ELBO will then publish the budget book, which is the real thick book that basically summarizes what the agencies are requesting and what the legislative budget recommendation is for fiscal year 26.
Stephen, let me ask you a question real quick in this budget cycle. And as somebody that's not on appropriations, are there any metrics that y'all measure, performance-based metrics, that when y'all look at these recommendations or these asks from these agencies, do y'all, during the, I guess, the time that ELBO's looking at them and asking those questions, are there performance metrics that y'all are measuring up against to see how well the agencies are performing the objectives they have set out when they make the request for the dollars? Is that?
Yes, sir. So there are performance metrics, and Corbin or Ava may want to add to this here, but essentially there's performance metrics that are stated in appropriation bills. And then there are additional performance metrics that are the agency reports on themselves. At the time the budget requests are submitted in August, they submit their, their financial ask, but they also have to submit their performance information. So we have a running set of data that provides how they've been performing against those metrics each year. And that is also part of the budget request that comes in each year. It's the legislature's discretion on what those performance metrics are that are set in the appropriation bill. So we are taking what they had in their bill against what they've reported to us. I don't know if Corbin or Ava want to add to that.
And we look at those performance metrics from year to year, and if an agency isn't meeting a certain performance, we usually bring those to y'all's attention during session and say, hey, this department should have been submitting this many forms or doing this, and they're not meeting that goal.
So unless ELBO makes us aware that they're not meeting the metrics, we are to assume that they are meeting the metrics in the, would that be a fair statement, or is there some report y'all present to?
Yeah, so it's in the budget book that we distribute to y'all. The performance measures are listed in there.
Okay.
And then also each year in different appropriation bills, there are performance metrics in there as well. And during session, the subcommittee chairman of each individual budget, for instance, Medicaid, their subcommittee chairman, we give them the performance measures and they review them at first action, second action, and final action. And we get a signature that says that they've reviewed them and approved them to be included in the appropriation bill. So.
Okay. All right.
I'll follow up with that, and Corbin knows this. I'm looking around the room. I see a couple of my appropriations members on this committee, and that's something I say every year is look at their performance measures. If you're the subcommittee chair, but I would invite every member and anybody that's listening, if you're interested in that agency's budget, look at the performance measures. I know when I was subcommittee chair, I spent more time on my particular subcommittee and going over that with that agency, saying, why are we not getting this many out? Or, good, you did a good job with this. You created this many opportunities. So That is very important that people sometimes gloss over. You need to look into the details, and you don't have to be on appropriations to do that, members. I mean, if you see something in there that you're concerned about, bring it to my attention or Corbin's or to the subcommittee chair to make sure that we're staying on top of our performance measures for every agency.
And the agencies that don't have performance measures in their bill, we still collect the data from the agencies. And for instance, if one agency might have 10 performance measures, we might collect 30 different metrics from them, and only 10 of them are included in the bill. Kind of the really relevant, pertinent information is included in the bill, but we still collect a lot of information from each of these agencies.
There's no other questions there. We're going to move forward into the appropriation phase of the budget process. Oh, let me go back. So the appropriation phase you're all familiar with. I won't spend a lot of time on this phase. Just kind of point out the highlights of the deadlines. These are the 2025 regular session deadlines for the appropriation process. You'll see on February the 26th is the first House action for appropriation bills. March 18th is the second House action. And then at the end of March on the 31st is the final action or for the adoption of conference reports. Once the legislature has concluded for the year and signee died, the Legislative Budget Office consolidates all the appropriation bills into a single publication. It's called the Budget Bulletin. It's available on our website. We do this during the month of May. And this summarizes all the appropriations that were done during the past session. So from this part, we're going to move into the actual FY25 budget and the numbers, if nobody has any other questions about the process itself. Okay. Moving to slide 8. This is a summary of the fiscal year 25 budget. This is listed by the funding sources for the state. The sum of all 4 of these is about $31.6 billion. For the purposes of today's conversation, we're going to focus on the general funds and the state sport funds. Those are the ones that are more directly tied to state revenue, which we'll talk about later in the day. But this is kind of the high-level outline of where our funds came from for FY25. Flipping over to slide 9. What you'll see on slide 9 is a summary of the top 10 budgets in the state of Mississippi from state support funds. What you'll notice is that about 80% of our state support funds are dedicated to the 10 agencies listed here. I don't think there'll be a big surprise to you as you see them from top to bottom. It's going to be the student funding formula at the Department of Education, Medicaid, and so forth down the page. The rest of the agencies in the state combined account for about $1.4 billion of state support funds. The all-in is $7.8 billion. Going to slide 10. Slide 10 is a year-over-year growth from fiscal year 24 to fiscal year 25 for general fund appropriations. This is general fund only. We've listed out some of the larger agencies and some of the agencies that received increase. And then again, we've summed up all the other agencies at the bottom. But what you'll see is that from fiscal year 24 to fiscal year 25, our general fund appropriations increased just under $329 million. A couple of the larger ones are going to be education and mental health and a few others down the page. The education was primarily because of the student funding formula. Mental health was related to their forensics, a decrease in the federal match, and a few other programs. Obviously there's inflationary costs built into these agencies. There are salaries increases that have been occurring over the past few years. So there's several different reasons for the increases, but we wanted to give you kind of a high level snapshot of what year over year looked like for general fund increases. Before I move on, do we have any questions on this?
Are you going to go in more into the funding sources? Or are y'all going to talk more about that? Or,
We'll speak briefly about the revenue that generates the general funds.
okay,
A little bit later, and I know we have the Department of Revenue here as well that'll speak to that.
okay.
Corbin pointed out that as part of this increase, one of the reasons of the increase also was for the PERS increase that happened in FY '25. It was 0.5%. She'll know that's being phased in over 5 years at 0.5% per year. Okay, slide number 11
Hey,
is
Stephen, remind us, just so everybody knows, what was the total dollar figure on the 0.5% increase per year? If y'all know, Corbin, you may have
15 million
15 million. So
for general
and
funds.
so that's over 5 years, $75 million increase roughly of PERS increases that we, based on the legislation that we passed this past year. Thank you.
Yes, sir, that's correct. That'll be, once it's fully phased in, and a recurring expenditure.
And that number might change from year to year as, you know, people get salary increases. That's a 0.5% on their current salary. Yeah.
Okay, from fiscal year '25, we're going to start looking at the out years. We're going to start looking at fiscal year '26 and beyond. Slide 11 shows you some future costs that are not currently budgeted for the state. What you'll see is just kind of a snapshot of some of the larger items to note that our staff is aware of and wanted to point out to this committee. I won't read them all off, but as you'll see, PERS, if we went to the actuarial recommended rate for the employer contribution of 25%, that would increase our general fund contribution by $243 million compared to where we are today. So that would be a recurring expenditure. Medicaid obviously is at 159 for fiscal year '26 and 296 in FY '27. They've been using cash that they have to kind of spend down to avert having to make big asks to the legislature. But as they spend that cash down, they will have to come back and ask for more. Education's is related to the funding formula. Health insurance, 5% annually for the next few years is kind of our expectation. So that'll again be a recurring expenditure added on to our general fund appropriations. The two at the bottom, DFA's Bureau of Buildings, this is the $1 billion. Obviously, they manage a large portfolio of buildings and real estate throughout the state. This is for maintenance of those buildings. It's some of it's deferred maintenance, some of it's just continuing projects, but that is the number we pull from them. And then the MDOT, the 36 million, this is for maintenance of effort issues with DOT so that we can continue with the federal match portion. Excuse me. DOT presents a 3-year annual plan each year. They have not given that to us yet because they were waiting to get what their ARPA numbers were going to look like for money that was going to be pulled back and given to them for their projects. So they were waiting to get that information. They have it now, and they'll be getting us their updated 3-year plan this month. So we'll have that information for you at a later time.
Is the MDOT, the 36 million, I thought it was 40 million or around 40 million?
Yeah, I think that 36 is what we always talked about is 40 million for the IIJA match. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
And
y'all
that's
remember
recurring for how many more years?
I'm sorry.
How many more years is that? Maybe
Two more years. Is that right?
Yeah.
Just one? We got one left on that? One? Okay. Y'all remember when the IIJA was passed by the federal government, we had a 5-year, Corbin, correct me if I'm off on my number, 5-year, $40 million roughly match to draw down those funds. So that's what that extra is. I thought we'd only done 3 years, but maybe we've done 4. This is a lot to digest on this page. Any questions, members, about some of the stuff that, I mean, PERS, that's just the actuarial increase, just FYI, so we're real clear on that. The number that we've passed legislatively is that 75 million that we were talking about over a 5-year period, not the 243 or 299 that you see there, but that's based on what the actuaries from PERS had recommended. Yeah, and that's right. Senator Harkinson, that does not include, too, that we've added money, cash out of last year's CapEx money to put into the PERS system to help stem the tide a little bit on some of the deficit there.
Mr. Chairman, is the 243 in addition to the 2 points that are coming, or is that factored in? Because
The 243 is compared against where we are today.
we've already committed to what would be 55 million or 50 million.
60 million more roughly.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's correct. Roughly 60 million more.
So I guess
from
you could
today.
subtract that from whatever that 243 or 299 million.
In the billion to the Bureau of Buildings, is this an ongoing project list? Is there a list of projects that they just have to keep working on the portfolio they manage?
That's correct. They have, every year they produce their basically capital needs study that includes the maintenance that's needed or recommended for all the buildings around the state. So this is not a new thing per se, but this is just an item to point out that there's maintenance that they're requesting money for on a regular basis.
And that document has it building by building, what needs to be done. It's really thorough, what the request is. So.
Thank you.
Senator Sparks, that's usually, in prior years, it's been part of the bond bill that there's a segment of the money that's allocated towards DFA to help renovate a building, fix air conditioners, whatever the case may be that's needing to go on. And the last couple of years, we've been using cash to pay for these, out of CapEx projects. But every year since I've been here, we've had a bond bill or we've had CapEx projects. Those are DFA's building requests are built into that. And that's ongoing. That's every year they're going to have that in perpetuity as long as they have as much real estate as they have to say grace over. We're going to be constantly updating, fixing, repairing roofs, refitting buildings and so forth. So that's where most of those projects have always been located in that project bill.
Okay, okay. From here, we're going to move to the next slide. Slide 12 summarizes the requests that we have received for fiscal year 26. So these are the actual requests that agencies have submitted for fiscal year 26. Now, this isn't all the agencies. This is a summary of some of them. But what this tells you is how much more money they are requesting for fiscal year 26 over what they actually received in fiscal year 25. The bottom there is 751 million. Please note that does include the PERS rate increase, and it also includes the health insurance increase that we're planning for. I'll give you just a minute to look through there, but you'll see Medicaid, the 159 number that we looked at on the last slide is also included in this increase. IHL had a request for some additional funding for salaries, campus repairs, and operational increases. DPS had a request of 67 million, and then MDOC, also asked for an increase related to the Medicaid medical contract and then salaries and some equipment. That's just a summary of what we have received for actual fiscal year request over FY 25.
And this does include general fund requests and capital expense requests.
That's correct. All state sport funds, which is general funds and capital expense. Okay, from here, we're going to transition into debt service and we're going to talk about revenue. I'm going to give the microphone over to Ava for her to talk about those items.
The next slide is the out-year payment projections of debt service. You'll see these payments start to slowly go down. And this is due to the past few years of using cash out of capital expense instead of bonding. The amount of debt service paid off since fiscal year 21 is $1.2 billion. But when bonding does resume, these numbers will increase. The debt service ask will increase and the debt service payments will increase. And this chart is a comparison of the revenue collections to the general fund appropriations. And you will see, starting in FY '21, the revenue shot up. It is the blue line. But it's beginning to level back out starting last year. And it also shows how much the general fund appropriation has grown since FY '21, but they are starting to it's starting to level back out along with revenue as well. Any questions on this one? Then the next one, I'm going to talk about the revenue estimate and the revenue estimating group. The revenue estimating group is comprised of the state economist, the state fiscal officer, the commissioner of revenue, the state treasurer, and the director of LBO. And in the fall, the group will get together and do a consensus estimate in each category and come to a consensus, and it will be presented to JLBC by the state economist. In fall, well, in October, it's approved with the joint in the legislative budget committee with the JLBC and the governor, which will be on November 14th. And then there's a spring, if needed, there's a spring estimate in March to see if it needs to be adjusted, and it will be brought before JLBC. The revenue estimate for FY '25 is $7.6 billion. The preliminary numbers for October, we are under the estimate by $27.6 million, which in turn for this fiscal year, we are only 18.4 million over the estimate. The revenue report will be out in the next few days, and then it will show where all of our categories are at in that. And Chris will go over more of the revenue when he gets up to talk. I just kind of wanted to hit on the revenue estimate a little bit and how the group comes up with the revenue estimate. And here's the 24-25 revenue estimate, an example of it.
You finished, Ava?
Yes, sir.
I
am.
Chris may hit on this if he will, that's fine. Tell us if we're about 18 million, you haven't finished up October, but we're about 18 million ahead.
For the year.
We were 45 million after the previous month, correct?
Yes, sir.
And we're, so we lost, as you said, some this month.
Yes,
out of that 18 million, do we know, and if Chris will do this, you can just say, I'll defer to Chris later, what categories, because you think about all the categories, sales, individual, corporate, use, insurance, oil and gas severance tax, et cetera. Do we know where we're up and down significantly? Is this all?
Yes, sir. 1 second.
Is this update, this chart, I hadn't even really looked at it yet.
I think that chart is how we built the current estimate for FY '25.
Okay.
And so out of that estimated amount, each year we take 2% set aside and then appropriate the remaining amount.
Will Chris talk about that, Ava? If he will, that's fine. Or Chris, are you?
Yeah,
Please.
Chris can talk about it. Chris.
All right.
Is the interest on investments, is that under?
That's below the line. It was 6.6 for this month over the estimate. That's what will come out in the revenue report. I got preliminary numbers from DFA at the end of the week for this meeting because I knew we would need these numbers. So I just got a preliminary numbers from them.
I'm looking at the interest on investments over 23, 24, and 25. It looks like it was up 364% in 23. And it was down 63% in 24. And it was up 70% in 25. Is that?
It was up 46% in 25. That was 70 over.
Oh,
70
I'm sorry.
million.
Yeah, so it was 40, so it was 364% up in 23, 63% down in 24 from 23.
Just under the estimate. That's not actuals. That's just under the
The
estimate.
estimate, okay,
The sine die under the estimate.
all right.
sir.
For the committee's edification, wasn't our traditional interest investment number about 30 million?
Yes, sir.
So just for everybody's knowledge, based on historical trends, we would average about $30 million of collection on our interest on investments. And of course, we had the spike when the funds, federal funds came in and some other things where the economy got better for us. But that's where you see those markedly high numbers and of course, drop year over year too, because we had a big number one year. But do you think that we'll be going back to 30 million? I mean, are trends saying that's stuff we need to talk about in this? Or are we thinking 30 million is going to be the number for the next few years? Or do we think that number should be changed? I know we still have money sitting in an account, so I think it's going to be higher, but
It will, I believe that number will go down just because of the spend of the ARPA funds and along with interest rate cuts. Because they're meeting again this week, I believe,
all right.
for interest rate cuts. The feds.
And I'm just trying to think if this is a good time to talk about, I guess we'll get into kind of trending stuff later. Maybe that's Chris's too. He and Corey can do more on predictions, I suppose. All right, y'all, Senator Sparks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I go back to the debt service slide 13? So if I'm looking at that correctly, we have about $3.9 billion in general obligation bonds principal. And then our payment each year, is that dictated by statute or is that dictated by the legislature? What we choose to pay, or is that just what's coming due and
I
we
believe
know
that's
what's
just
coming
what's
due?
coming due.
Okay, so that's fixed to a great degree. Because, I mean,
Yes, sir. It's just what's coming due at the time. And a lot of these payments are higher because of the, what's it called? Reconsolidation. Like they refinanced a bunch of loans.
so it saves us money in the long run. And I think the reason I ask that is because outside of general obligation bonds, do we have other significant debt on the books, or is this where the majority of our debt lies as a state?
We have the revenue bonds, but they are not really.
They're tied back to revenue,
Yeah.
so they're not.
Yes,
The
sir.
reason I ask that is obviously we're talking about revenue, how we, generate funds for the state, and now we're talking about expenses. And sometimes when people are trying to figure out what policies to go forward with, they look strictly at those two items. I'm bringing in X, I can spend up to X, less than 2% set aside. But if you factor your debt service as part of your spend, then that's fine. I'm asking the PERS question. That's a liability that is an actuarial accrued liability. What, if any, factor do we take that in consideration? Because that's the biggest debt item, if you want to call it a debt, we have. There's no consideration for it. Is that?
Make sure I understand your question correctly, Senator. Are you asking what considerations given to how much we're going to pay on debt service?
Well, not so much what we're paying on debt service, just as people are considering cutting revenue, in some fashion, whether revenue goes down because the economy turns or additional tax cuts, because the numbers we're looking at today, there's still 2 years worth of income tax coming in that are cuts. But ultimately, to pay the debt, you've got to be able to pay your expenses plus pay your debts. And the PERS piece, I think, is the big piece, as you showed earlier.
I think you're hitting on a very, very important point, and that is you can look at on that slide and you can see the total payments that would have to be made. That could change in a year if we take additional debt. I think Ava or Stephen said that earlier. Obviously, we're going to have to pay more, and depending on where we are, that's the $1 billion question, I guess. Depending on where we are as far as how we're able to fund basic government services. I think we would all love to be able to be at a place where we can continue to pay this debt off like we have been and don't incur any additional debt. But if we do, because we've got a building that needs a new roof or HVAC or whatever it is that's needed, or we've got a road that's got to be done, or whatever reason we say it's worth it to incur additional debt, that's going to raise this number up more, which means you got more money going out. If you've cut a revenue source, you obviously have more money going out to pay debt, and that number will change.
And that's finally goes back to our bond rating, which is, the less money you have borrowed against whatever your available credit would be. But again, does that PERS liability ultimately affect us from the standpoint of our bond rating?
So when the credit rating agencies look at the state, they factor in all debt. So they'll look at our annual financial report, which includes a summary of all debt in the state, which includes the PERS unfunded liability as well. So they do factor in the state's total financial health and well-being when they're given the bond ratings.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And this is simply commentary, but I think probably, y'all tell me if I'm wrong, but we're probably pretty decent on our just GO bond debt. We're not compared, especially related to what we have the capacity to do. I think it's the PERS debt that probably puts us in a much worse situation as far as how bond rating companies, and obviously for those that don't know, that's going to matter. If we have to borrow money, it certainly is going to matter what interest we have to pay on it.
Real quick, one of the budgetary items that we have, you haven't talked about, I don't know if you're going to talk about it, our rainy day fund. What's the status, or what's the amount that's in the rainy day fund right now?
Currently, right now in rainy day is $667 million. It's 666 and some change, but I rounded up.
Yeah, let's round it up $1 if you don't mind. So that's basically a 10% of our
the
general fund.
Previous year's appropriation.
General fund appropriation.
Yes, sir.
Have y'all had any indication from maybe colleagues in other states that y'all talk with? Have other states done anything to adjust their rainy day fund? Is there any?
Yes, sir. From conferences we have gone to, we are currently the lowest rainy day reservation fund in the country. Most states are at 12%, between 12 and 20%. With some of their leftover cash, many states were funding their about 15% into their rainy day, and some states actually put the rest of it into their PERS system. After a certain amount, they dropped it over into PERS. But we did other states just are more between that 12 and 15% more comfortably. They're at least at $1 billion. Most states are at least at $1 billion, if not more.
Okay. Are we tied for the lowest with anybody? Or are we? We're at the top of the podium by ourselves.
It's just we did a thing with Moody's. They did a kind of a educational thing, and we would not last 3 months, I don't believe. Like with our rainy day, with our reserves, it was like a 3-month. They did a health of how, if something drastic were to happen, how long could we last with payroll and everything and I believe it was 3 months.
Okay. So 12 to 15 is what the average is for most states. What about states that are, you hear some states that are having deficit issues. Are they utilizing their rainy day fund? Because I'm trying to think of, and I don't know the last time, maybe you can help me. When's the last time we've dipped into the rainy day fund?
That's probably 2016, 17, somewhere we had to use some of the rainy day then. We may have had to do it 2 years then. We obviously had to do it. I'm gonna look at the elder statesman here, Senator Kirby. We did it during the recession. I feel certain it got down pretty low, but we built it back up. And that was 2009, 10, 11 period. And then we came back again.
In 2020, it was dipped into as well.
During the COVID.
During COVID.
Yeah. Well,
Yes, sir.
yeah. And of course, we were maybe a couple $100 million up before COVID hit. I see Chris smiling because he was in Corbin's position then, but I remember that was my first year as appropriations chairman. We were feeling great, and then 1 month we went to $200 million down. And I'm rounding, but we got hit hard, and I think we had to use some. And of course, we made pretty significant budget cuts that year. Thankfully, it was not as hard and drastic as it we thought it was going to be, even just a week or two before the end of that session, which ended in July. But I don't remember if we used some rainy day to help piece together that budget. We supplanted it later, but that may have been just to get through that rough patch there for a month or two. Ava, do you know?
We pulled a little bit to cover.
Okay,
Leanne.
to cover the budget.
Leanne, chiming in.
Okay, all right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, yes, we dipped into it just 4 years ago.
Off the top of your head, what would it, if we went up 2% more, what would that be? Another, what, 120? I'll do 840, 800.
Yeah.
So we would have to add 180 million
80.
to where we are, 170 million roughly to get up there.
All right. Keep going.
That concludes what we have prepared to present to the committee this morning, unless you have further questions for us.
Are there any questions? I know we have some on Zoom. Give everybody a moment to, if they want to ask any questions. Senator Black.
Thank you. On the general fund revenue collections versus general fund appropriations, what caused that spike from fiscal year 2021 onward in collections?
From the ARPA, and just people spending money again, I believe, but I'll let Chris go over that some more too.
Chris, you got a lot. Thank you.
All right, well, there are no more questions. Thank y'all for your information. And I think we're probably going to wind up having another meeting and drill down into some of these examples you gave us of things that are to be expected. I think there's a lot of issues that we want to kind of look into and see what the trend's going to be going forward as it relates to education, Medicaid, PERS, some of these things that we talked about. So we may have y'all back at the next meeting, but I appreciate all the effort y'all put into preparing for today and the information y'all gathered for us. And if we have any other questions come up later on, we'll be sure to follow back up. Thank y'all. All right, we're going to take a quick 3-4 minute break, and we'll have Chris Graham with Department of Revenue come up and present. All right, we'll go ahead and get started with the next presenter, Mr. Graham from the Department of Revenue. Does everybody have a handout from Department of Revenue? Everybody got one with them? Okay. Senator Polk, you had a,
Yes, before we get started, I'd like to ask the commissioner a question, if I may.
absolutely.
Commissioner, was there a smaller type that you could have possibly used in printing this? Or is this the smallest you could get for us old guys?
We will try to make it a little bit larger next time, Senator Polk. I do give you my apologies. And there's a funny story, but not really that funny story about those pages. We do have a little bit larger, not much, larger version of that in your handout. But in my rush to get you my presentation, I pulled the wrong third page. And so my pages 5, 6, and 7 in your handout, we probably need to mark X's through because I pulled the wrong last page. And so that's a replacement. And we wanted to make it small so you couldn't compare the numbers and tell what I messed up. So we will try to make it larger for you next time, sir.
I will just say this, you will get old one day.
All right, thank y'all for being here. Commissioner Graham, you're free to begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee. I've been the Revenue Commissioner since July of 2020. Went in right in kind of in the middle of the pandemic, right after not really after the session that was so long in 2020, but kind of during the middle of the session because y'all ended up coming back in later in the year. And what I wanted to do this morning, of course, try to answer any questions you have, but I wanted to kind of go over what we do, what we collect, kind of what we've been seeing since 2020, and maybe a little bit, some of our slides go a little bit further back than that, to just give you an idea of what the sources of our revenue are, what is it that we collect, and then there's some things that we don't collect. And so I do have the larger handout that has the pie chart on the front. And I like this handout because it's a really good summary of all the dollars that we collect. We collected about $10.8 billion last year. And this report shows that most of what we collected, y'all have us sending it to the general fund. And so if you look at the very top number, we sent $7.3 billion to the general fund. That's all the funds that the Department of Revenue collects. Now, there are what Ava mentioned is the below the line numbers. Those are numbers that DFA assembles and collects themselves. And that was about 300 or 400 million last year. So in all, the general fund received about 7.7 billion last year. And I think I have a slide later on that shows the total amount that was received by the general fund last year. But of the part we collect, about 68%, 67% of what we collected last year went to the general fund. But this report also, I think, shows the priorities of the legislature. So we don't just collect the money and send it wherever we want to. Y'all have passed laws that tell us exactly where you want the money going. And I think this first page here really shows you what the priorities of the legislature have been over the last several years. And so you can see we send $900 million to municipalities. We send $600 million to transportation. That next line is refunds and individual and corporate. So we do collect money that we do have to send back out to taxpayers in the form of refunds, and that's what that number represents. Y'all send a whole bunch of money to education. Now, keep in mind, that's in addition to the large general fund appropriation that the Department of Education receives. These are special funds that they receive off the top. And so when you talk about the Education Enhancement Fund, most of those funds are EEF funds that the Department of Education receives that y'all still appropriate, but it doesn't come out of our general fund appropriation. Counties, we sent $320 million to counties last year. And then that next one is called the Ad valorem Reduction Fund. That's what I would like to call that the legislative tag credit. So when people go in to buy a tag, the largest expense on a tag is your ad valorem taxes that your local governments assess. The state doesn't get any of that, but you do provide a diversion to local governments so that people get a discount on their tag. So you're reimbursing the local governments for the price of a tag and giving them the ad valorem tax. So the taxpayer's not actually having to pay that. And it's a substantial discount off of the price of a car tag in all of our counties. So that's a very large number we don't talk a lot about, but last year we collected and transferred $312 million to that fund, and that's used to reimburse the counties whenever people go in and buy their car tags. And then there's other special funds. There's just a whole bunch of other places that we send money, and that was about 200 million. The next page gives you a little bit more detail on those transfers, like the sources of those dollars. I won't go through all of those. I did want to point out a couple of them while we're here. The first set of numbers are dollars that y'all transferred to municipalities. And the one that really jumps out to me is the sales tax number. It's $575 million last year that y'all transferred to municipalities. That is the municipal share of sales tax. That's the 18.5% diversion that you all send to locals for sales that occur within a particular municipality. So that totaled $575 million last year. The other one that really jumps out at me on this page is the use tax number under municipalities. We transferred $132 million to the use tax. I think we call it the Use Tax Modernization Fund, that is then used to transfer to municipalities as part of your, I think it was the 2018 special session that you all had where you created the Use Tax Modernization Act that allows local governments to receive part of the use tax monies. So that number is 132 million. And keep in mind, that number was zero back in 2017, 2016. I've got a slide to show you all in just a second. So that's new money that you all send to locals. You know, they're restricted what they can use that money on. I think it's road, bridge, water, sewer, infrastructure type expenditures they can use that money. And then the third one that really jumps out to me is the city special levies. Last year, y'all sent 115 million to locals for special levies. That's going to mostly be your tourism type taxes, the hotel, motel, or the restaurant taxes that locals. There's just a whole bunch of those. We probably have in excess of 80 of those now that we help collect and disperse to the locals.
Chris, let me ask you something on the use tax that we're sending back to cities and counties. Is this 132 million? Is that total of the money you send to municipalities and counties, or you got a, never mind, you got a use tax down here for the counties as well? Part of that legislation was that they had to maintain a minimum spend. Have y'all had instances where cities or counties were eligible for use tax revenue and didn't get it because they didn't do their maintenance of effort? And if so, does that money just accumulate in the fund, or what do you?
I think we've had very limited experience or limited times where they haven't qualified for the full expenditure. And in that case, the money stays in the fund for distribution the next time around. And so if you don't meet your minimum spend, and we've also had municipalities make errors in their forms that we've had to correct after the fact, but we've had just a couple of times where they haven't maintained their minimum spend. It hasn't occurred a lot. And y'all have tweaked that a little bit, I think, to let them count some additional things along the way toward their minimum spend the last session or two. And I think it probably helps some of our locals whenever y'all tweak them.
Do they have the opportunity to catch up for those funds if they spend additional monies the following year that over and above the minimum spend, or what happens to that excess money? Is it just?
The money stays in the fund to be distributed according to the formula the next time that the money is distributed. So they lose it.
If somebody misses it, then that money never gets absorbed by anybody, technically speaking.
It would stay in the pot to be divided up next time amongst all of them. So if you had $100 left over in the pot because somebody didn't meet their minimum spend, whenever the next distribution occurs, we do this twice a year. Whenever the next distribution occurs, that money's added to the amount of money that's available for distribution to all municipalities or counties.
Would those monies, when a municipality or county misses it, if somebody missed $500,000, there's no way that can be, because everybody's capped by the amount. I mean, they're limited by the formula. Are they not? I mean, shouldn't that money just grow and sit there and I mean, it would never be absorbed by anybody. If you're going off a formula and your minimum spend, you're only eligible up to a certain number.
I believe it would come out. I don't think I've done the calculation on it.
Or I mean, how?
Yeah, and
I'd just be curious. I mean, I'm just curious if that ever happens. I mean, I'm hoping everybody uses the money, and
we've had very limited times where somebody didn't meet their minimum spend.
Okay, all right. Senator Kirby, you had a question real quick.
A comment and a question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, under the special levies, and you were talking about the car tag, I think we passed that in mid-90s maybe. The reason why the legislature kept getting blamed for the car tax being so high. And of course, I think what the state was getting was like, what, at that time, $12 or $12.50 for a tag. All the rest of it was county ad valorem. Since we were getting blamed for it, we decided that we would reimburse the counties. And I think it's usually 40 or 50% on each car tag. Also, and I don't know if they're doing it, but each county is supposed to have on there less legislative discount. on there to let everyone know that we're paying them with their tax money back and supplementing the counties. And most of that, of course, calls from bond issues and that type thing. Now, the other thing, just a simple question, but you may not have the information here, but on the municipal sales tax, can you tell me how much of that is on grocery tax?
On the special levy side of things, or?
No, that was on the regular sales tax,
Okay.
municipality reimbursement.
On the sales tax, yes, sir, I can. The general fund receives most of that money, but as it relates only to municipalities, I've got a slide that covers that. It would probably be it's less than $80 million, I think is what our estimate is. So about $80 million. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, $80 million.
So
So out of the 500 I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
so
you.
if we did away with the grocery tax, then it'd be $80 million.
It would be more than $80 million, but to municipalities, that's a rough estimate. I've got a slide. I'll cover that very briefly when we get
Okay.
to sales tax, but it's about $80 million to the municipalities. And depending on how you do it, it could cost the state upwards of 400 million as well, 300 to 400 million as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Wow.
Yeah, Senator Polk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's talk about the use tax just a moment. When we passed the bill in, I believe, 2018, use tax is what I'm calling computer tax. That's what we call something when we buy it online and there's tax now charged to it. Is that correct?
Use tax means a lot of things, yes, sir, but it's online purchases as well that come from delivered out of state to the state. Y'all passed, and I've got a slide on that as well, the Marketplace Facilitator Act back in 2020 that says that the department can collect sales taxes from any entity that serves as a marketplace facilitator. That's your online sales stores. So we do collect quite a bit of use tax from those types of entities.
And as I remember, when we passed that, what we do is take the percent of a city's sales tax of the total and apply that same percent to use tax. So if Hattiesburg, where I'm from, has a very large percent of people coming in from out of county to the city and spending money, that will raise their amount of sales tax percent because it's what dollar is spent physically in that city. Is that correct?
That's generally correct. I heard Senator Hobson giving a really good explanation of the three ways that money is divided. I think they've probably looked it up. I think it's based on every municipality gets a set amount. Then a part of it, a third of it's based on, I think it's a third, is based on your sales tax compared to everybody else's sales tax. And I think there's another piece that's based on rural road miles or something like that in the municipality. So it's two or three factors, but generally speaking, yes, if you have more in sales tax, your cut of that part of it is certainly larger than others.
Okay.
If that answered your question. I didn't look at the specific three things. I've got a sheet that we could go through. Senator Hobson, I think, gave a really good description while I was talking with Senator Kirby. I was overhearing his description of the three things that I think they may have looked it
I was
up.
going to get Corbin to read them off real quickly since he's got the computer pulled up.
I think it's equal share, proportion of rural road miles, and then proportion of rural population of the
Okay,
county.
population, okay. The county is a little different from municipalities. It's close to the same. I've got it right here. If I can read it. So municipalities is 3 million in equal shares. That's the part I said everybody gets the same amount. And then there are two other pieces. Half is based on population and half is based on city diversion. So they don't have rural road miles in the city version. The rural road miles comes in the county version. So the county is a third in equal share, a third based on rural road miles, and then a third based on population.
Somebody else have a question? Senator Sparks, did you have one? Did you have a question? Okay. All right. Go ahead, Carissa.
So going back to the sheet that I was talking about earlier, yes, Senator Harkins, we did send 132 million to the use tax fund for municipalities. And because the percentage is the same for counties, they also received 132 million to that fund. And so that's if you look at the county number, that's the second set of numbers on that sheet on page 2. That is really the one that jumps out at me, is the 132 million that went to the county use tax modernization fund for distribution to the counties. Transportation, I'll tell you, if you look at transportation, which I've got, the very next slide shows you that transportation's funding is, as far as the diversions that we make, has stayed pretty level throughout the years. And that, I think that's primarily because our fuel tax is based on an amount of fuel, not based on price. And so their funding has stayed pretty much the same over a period of time. It's increased a little bit, but not a lot. And then recent increases to their diversion also, I think, is related to the money through the Use Tax Modernization Act, because y'all do transfer some use tax dollars to them as well as a result of that 2018 special session. And of course, that doesn't include any of the appropriations that y'all have made. Y'all have made substantial appropriations to the Department of Transportation in the last 3 years. A lot of it with capital expense funds, and then some of the other federal funds that y'all have received. Y'all have really spent a lot of money. These are just the diversions that we make off of every dollar that we collect. So you have to keep in mind, just because we divert the same amount to transportation, that doesn't mean that y'all have not been funding them substantially over the last several years. I think transportation has received excellent amount of funding. Our municipalities have received an excellent amount of funding, and our counties have received record amounts of funding over the last several years. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Education funding, most of their transfers that we make come from the EEF, which is a transfer off the sales tax. I think they receive, the biggest part is 9% off of the sales tax. Y'all also, they receive it off the use tax, and I'm about to show you the growth in the use tax. So they've really benefited from the increase in sales tax and use tax as well. So page 3. This does show you some of the trends for our top diversions that we do every year. And this goes back to 2016. And each of the lines on this page are labeled what they represent. And just starting with the general fund, back in 2016, we were collecting about 5.4 billion that would go to the general fund. And I went ahead and marked 2020 because it was such a big year with the pandemic and everything that was going on, which was 5.6 billion is what we collected for the general fund that year. And for the year just ending in June, we collected 7.3 billion for the general fund. That doesn't count the other 300 or 400 million that the Department of Finance and Administration sent to the general fund. And so I think the total general fund collections last year were about $7.7 billion. Municipalities, I think that's one that you can see the dramatic growth since 2020. So they went from 615 million in 2020 to 911 million in 2024. The next page is it really shows you why. So page 4. That shows you the total sales tax and use tax that we diverted to municipalities and counties. And really, it shows you in 2020 is when we started implementing the Use Tax Modernization Act. It went into effect July of 2020. And if you'll recall, you increased the percentage every year until it got to 15% goes to counties, 15% goes to municipalities, and then I think another 5 goes to some transportation needs. And so you can really see the number grow. I'm trying to remember, I think it was 23 when it was really fully implemented. So you can see in 2023, we transferred 125 million to municipalities, 125 million to counties. And so really, if you look at what we've sent to municipalities from use tax from 2020 to 2024, it's grown substantially. And that's why it's so, on this chart on page 3, that's why it has such a steep curve. Transportation is the next one on page 3 that has a line. And as I mentioned earlier, it's been kind of flat on the diversion side of things. And you can see in 2020, it also had a slight increase. And I believe that's mostly due to the use tax money that they received as well. Not all that goes to the Department of Transportation. It goes to State Aid Road, and y'all send some money to counties through State Aid Road as well. And so that you can see there's a slight increase, but not as large of an increase as municipalities saw. Of course, education increased similar to the general fund because it relies so much on that EEF relies so much on sales tax and then also use tax. And then the county's number also dramatically increased. In 2020, y'all were sending $160 million to counties. That's almost doubled since 2020, which I think shows a substantial investment in county government. If there are any questions, I'll turn to page 5, 6, and 7 and remind Senator Pope that that's where I want him to look at the sheet that he cannot read because it's got too small a writing on it. I want to apologize to the committee. I did pull the wrong third page, and so the numbers on the third page are off. It's last year's numbers. I just wanted to apologize for putting that in this report, but the other handout that you have is going to be the report that we will end up putting in our annual report, and these are the final numbers as far as what we collected. And so what these 3 sheets show is pretty much an overview of everything the Department of Revenue collects. Of the $10.8 billion we collected last year, it's every transfer that we do. It shows you where we transferred that money, and it's organized by tax type. And so if you wanted to see, where the state sends sales tax, this is a sheet you can see everywhere where the state sends sales tax. And it goes through every tax that we collect. I did want to jump and cover a couple of them, really the top 5, if it's okay with the committee, and I'm happy to try to answer questions about any of them, to cover the top 5 in a little bit more detail. And so I have a slide on several of these in the top 5. So sales tax last year, I do want to point out to you, the very top line, it says sales tax, total transfers, $4.2 billion that we collected in sales tax last year. Only 2.8 of that goes to the general fund, and then almost 1.4 gets transferred other places. And over to the right shows you everywhere that we transfer those amounts.
Let me ask you a question right here. So based on, I don't like doing public math, but based on the calculator here, it looks like there's about 32% of our sales tax that's diverted.
That's correct. Yes, sir. And on page 10, there's a little bit more detail on the percentages that we can look at whenever y'all are ready to look at it.
And so on every dollar of sales tax brought in, there's about 32 cents that's diverted out of it.
Out of the general fund. It
Out of
does
the
not go
general
to the
fund.
general fund. Some of that goes to state needs and some of it goes to local needs, and all that's specified over on the right-hand column.
Okay. Are any of these diversions, are any of them capped, or is it a straight percentage of sales tax collected?
I believe school ad valorem is capped. I believe the educational facilities revolving loan fund is capped. The state aid road amount, I believe that's a set amount in the statute. And I think the rest of them are either based on a particular type of tax or sales tax in general.
So 32% could fluctuate based on if there's more sales tax, because some of these are capped. They're not getting additional funds. So the percentage would go down as more than 4.18 billion is collected.
That's right.
Okay.
If it's okay with the committee, I'll go ahead and jump to page 8. And I'd like to focus for a couple of minutes on the general fund, because that's when we're talking about the budget every year, we're mostly talking about the general fund. Those are the dollars that are hard to come by because you have so many agencies, so many needs, and that are presented to you all. Yes, sir.
Before you jump to page 8, Chris, will you come back at some point and talk about, I'd like to see trending on all these sources of revenue. Have you got that at some point in the packet?
I think it's on page 9, but I just really included the top 5. So I do have some trending on,
Okay.
I believe that'll cover some of your question.
Yeah, I mean, you heard the discussion about the interest on investments a while ago, but any of them, I mean, the small ones probably aren't going to matter that much, but any of the big ones will certainly matter as where we've been and where we're going.
They all matter, and I do have the overall number at the bottom of that chart that I was going to present to you, but a lot of the smaller ones don't move the needle every year, but I know they all matter when you're trying to make the budget meet at the end of the year. You've got to have every dollar that you can, but I'd be happy to try to trend all of them if you'd like for me to, but I do have the prepared chart for the top 5 or so.
That's fine. We'll wait till you get there.
Okay, so the general fund, that's what everybody always talks about when they talk about the state budget. The general fund last year, we collected 7.3 billion, and this chart shows you where that money came from. And so if you look at the bar chart or the lines, we collected $2.8 billion for sales tax last year. That represented about 38% of all the general fund transfers. It's by far the largest that goes into the general fund. Individual income tax, it can vary from year to year. I've seen it as low as 28 and as high as 32, but last year it was 30.6 of the general fund. Insurance premium, corporate and franchise tax. It was 13.2% of the general fund last year. That's one that's grown quite a bit over the last several years. Insurance premium is one that's grown probably more than normal in the last maybe year and a half, 2 fiscal years. It's now 5.8% of the general fund. Use tax, when you hear me talk about how the use tax has grown so much, we'll see a chart in just a second that shows you why it's not more of the general fund. It's because you all transfer most of that out. Unlike sales tax, which we all receive 67, 68%, use tax, you're down below 50% that comes to the general fund because you're transferring most of that out. But that's probably been the largest, from a percentage basis, the largest growing category we've had over the last 5 years. Gaming, it's one that has not, it's been up and down, minor, but mostly down over the last 20 years. It's not one that's been strongly growing in the state, although it's still, I've got a slide on it later on, it's still an important piece of revenue for the state. It just has not been quite as robust as some of these others through the pandemic. And then the rest of them are listed there. The next page, which is page 9, which I think kind of hits on what Senator Hobson was discussing.
Chris, before
Yes,
you
sir.
go on, he's got a question, then I've got a question.
Real quick, if you could go back to page 5 on the diversions from sales tax, use tax, and individual income. Individual income, look, I know the number is about 19% of individual income is diverted out from the total collected. We collected 2.78 billion, 2.246 billion went to the general fund. 540 million was diverted to special funds, and I see a large portion of it, about 497 million, was a refund account. But these other diversions, advantage job incentive, I mean, these are diversions that go to pay obligations, if you will, to companies that located here as part of economic development incentive packages. So those are a liability in a sense, are they not?
They are, and I think those are also affected to the extent you start completely doing away with the income tax. The state will have to make a decision. How do you fund those? How do you live up to those commitments? And then how do you fund those commitments? And so if there are no withholding taxes for some of these credits, there's nothing to fund it. And then also the people who are receiving those funds don't receive them, because I do think it's based on, some of them are based on withholding from the entities. So that's something you'll have to wrestle with and consider, I think, if y'all are having any discussions about further reducing or eliminating the income tax.
Yeah, and I'm looking, it's almost about $45 million.
And I have a chart that does show you, it's not in this, I have a chart that shows you the total credits, but it doesn't break it out with what's individual and what's other things. But I do have a chart that would show you all of the credits that need to come out of individual. I think that we could share with the committee at some point.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Chris, looking back on the block chart that you have, and I noticed the corporate and franchise tax being just under $1 billion in revenue. Back in 16, I think it was, we stepped down the franchise tax. And I think, what do we have, 2 or 3 years left?
I think it will be done in 2028. So that's
FY 28, so 3 years,
3 years,
three
yes, sir.
budget years left. So that's going to, Jan.
28 is 28, yes, sir.
Okay, so that'll be eliminated. What's the likely effect of that just on raw numbers? I know you can't forecast. What does that mean for additional revenue that may be spent by others? But raw numbers.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. On page 20, we have a listing of the Taxpayer Pay Raise Act, in the entire Taxpayer Pay Raise Act. And so that act phased out the franchise tax, which, as you mentioned, that's not quite finished yet. It also phased out the 3% bracket, which is finished. It phased out, it implemented a self-employment tax deduction. And we originally estimated that that entire tax package would cost about 415 million. Our revised estimate as of about a year ago is that that's going to be a $477 million reduction in revenue to the state once fully implemented. And we still estimate about 42 million a year, roughly, on the franchise tax piece. And so that at the top, I think shows you the fiscal years with our $42 million estimate in blue, which is remaining. And when it's all done, we're roughly 316 million, but 42 million a year for the 24, 25, 26, and 27. And you know, the hard part when we describe these is there's a tax year and then there's also a fiscal year. And while the fiscal year is when it will be 2028, when it will be finally phased out.
So really 3 more years left on the 3 more fiscal years, 25, which we're in now, and 26 and 27. So $126 million roughly, just raw numbers that will be phased out.
Yes, sir.
So I didn't realize, I couldn't remember the numbers. So between this taxpayer reduction and the 2022 reduction that we did, we're over $1 billion in taxpayer relief between corporate individual income tax cuts, correct?
I trust your math. I'd have to use my calculator.
We were at roughly 525 plus on the 22 individual income tax, and this one's going to be, 477 based on your revised estimates. So we're $1 billion or more probably.
So page 19 kind of has the latest estimate on the 2022 legislation. And I haven't added it up today, but I think that may add up to like 600 million roughly. And so it's going to be exceeding $1 billion.
I think the conservative estimates were at the time 525, and then I think some of us felt like it was probably going to be in excess of 600 when it was all said and done.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you.
So going back to page 8, and then I think I just turned over to page 9 to talk a little bit about trends. Although I will say I'm not a state economist, but lucky you all, Corey Miller, the state economist, is here. So I'm sure he could tell you all about trends. This chart has a lot of information on it on page 9. It shows you kind of the top 5 taxes that we collect: sales tax, income tax, corporate, franchise, use, and insurance premium tax. And I really just wanted to give you all an idea of what things have done since 2020, all the way up to the revenue projections for 2025 that were adopted by the legislature last year. And so in 2020, we were collecting about 2.1 billion in sales tax. Now this is just for the general fund. In 2024, we collected 2.8 billion. So that's an increase of about $700 million over that period of time. And we're projecting in 2025 to bring in about $2.9 billion in sales tax. And so last year, sales tax finished really strong. I'll tell you, there were some questions about how we're doing this year. With sales tax, we're about level. We're a little bit above what we did last year so far this year with sales tax, although we've increased the estimate a little bit. And so we are trailing just below the estimate on sales tax. So it hasn't been quite as strong as was predicted back in, I think, March or April of last year.
Is the estimate 2911?
Yes, sir.
So we're just
2911.
trailing just behind it.
We're just almost on pace to bring in the sales tax number, actual number for 2024, which would be 2.8. I think we're either slightly above or slightly below that for the year.
Okay.
But it's tracking, I think it's slightly above what we did last year so far this year. Of course, we're early in the fiscal year. There are a lot of big months to come. And so there's still a lot of tax to be collected, whether you're talking about the Christmas season or Valentine's Day and all those big things that are coming up. We collect a lot of sales tax later on. Income tax in 2020, we collected 1.8 billion. And you can see it kind of peaked out in FY 2022 at 2.5 billion. And you really start seeing in 2024 some of the effects of the tax reform, I believe. But you also had that really big spike. So my opinion on what happened with income tax and sales tax, and I would certainly defer to our state economist, my opinion of what happened with some of these numbers is you had, after the pandemic, you had an immediate increase in spending power. And so people had more money to spend. Then you started to have some inflation. And so that generated some more revenue for the state. And then you kind of had wage inflation, I think, that kind of followed the economic inflation. And so I think those three things combined really contributed to that massive spike y'all saw on the earlier charts. It's kind of those three things occurring. I think we've gotten back to a more normal cycle, whatever that is. As you look at the numbers this year, they look a little bit more like a typical year that you would see, and not so much like what we've seen over the couple previous fiscal years we've had. And so I do think you've gotten, barring other things that happen in the world that will just happen as they go, it looks like we've gotten into a little bit more normal pattern as far as economic growth from a tax standpoint. Corporate income and franchise tax, that's one that's grown substantially. As Chairman Hobson mentioned, we collected over $1 billion in 2023. That was up from $548 million in 2020. And keep in mind, that's in the face of doing away with 42 million or so a year of franchise tax. And so that's with tax cuts that number has continued to grow. They tell me that's the hardest number to predict, and that has been very true in my short experience with the Department of Revenue, because there's so many factors that go into what's taxable income for a corporation. But that's one that will continue, I think, to be strong in the short term, at least. We're predicting 970 million, so we were really predicting flat. I think that's one that has not quite done as well this year. So that one hasn't been quite as strong this year. But again, we're still early in the year, and there's plenty of time to either go up or down from where we are now. The other one I'd like to point out to you all is insurance premium tax. Just over the last, it usually is pretty steady in its growth, and over the last year and a half or so, we've seen a fairly substantial increase. So it's gone from FY23, it was 364, and now it's 425, and it's running heavy this year too. So it looks like it's going to be a really big year for insurance premium as well this year. I think that's due to a couple of things. I think, and I'm gonna let Jan explain this if y'all start asking questions. It involves Medicaid. So there's insurance premium tax paid through the Medicaid process. And then it also involves increasing property insurance premiums. I think it's kind of a combination, but I think a big driver of that has been an increase in Medicaid payments related to the Medicaid program. I'd like to just very quickly, since we've already talked about it, but turn to page 10, and that really shows you the real breakdown of what we do with the sales tax dollars. The little chart at the bottom is the one I was referring to earlier, Senator Harkins. Out of every dollar we collect, we send about 67% to the general fund. The municipalities receive about 13, 14%, and that number can fluctuate every year depending on, how heavily the sales tax numbers are in municipalities, because they receive 18.5% of every sale that occurs in their municipality. So that number can vary over the overall percentage based on what's sold in the municipalities. Education, as I mentioned earlier, they receive a whole lot of money from the sales tax. And in the motor vehicle ad valorem reduction fund, that one is funded with most of the sales tax on the purchase of automobiles goes to that fund to be funded at the locals. There is a diversion, and I've got a chart, I think it's maybe on the next page, where some of the motor vehicle sales that occur in municipalities, they are diverted to the locals, but not all of it. So the next page shows you our different tax rates, sales tax rates.
The sales tax on the vehicles, what, 5%? 5%, and they don't get 18.5% of the 5%.
I believe they get 18.5% of the first 3%, and then the remaining 2 all goes to the motor vehicle ad valorem reduction fund, I believe is how that works.
And I'm looking back at the numbers. We sent about 300 million of state funds that were diverted for motor vehicle, but if I'm looking at your chart right, 230 of that was directly due to the sales on the vehicles. The other 70 general funds.
There are a couple of sources of those transfers. One is the sales tax on motor vehicles, and then there's also the use tax on motor vehicles. There's a big use tax number, and then there's casual sales.
Yeah,
Those two.
those two were 300 million, the diversions on the sales and use, I think, based on your earlier chart. So
Yeah. Which page are you on? Sir
that
Council?
was your 5, 6, 7. Looks like you had 74 million to use tax and 230 million for sales tax. 300 million, roughly 305, $6 million roughly.
Yeah, and I can get you a breakdown of where all those funds came from and what we actually paid out. And what we paid out was actually a little higher because that fund had accumulated some extra dollars in it. And so we actually paid out more than that to locals. And that's on another one of my sheets. I'd be happy to get some more information to the committee on that. It's
Yeah,
more in the
just-
range
just
of 300 million this year.
Help me reconcile that at some
Yeah.
point on
Okay.
where the additional funds are. All right, go ahead.
So page 11 shows you all of our tax rates. The main tax rate that everybody normally talks about is the 7% general retail sales rate. That's on most of your tangible personal property is what you pay. And then these other categories are rates that the legislature at some point has decided would be more appropriate on other things. And page 12 shows you, this is a,
Chris, let me stop you right here real quick. Do you have a number off the top of your head of how many services we apply sales tax to?
I don't. I have a really good sheet that shows the services that we apply sales tax. Greg may have a number off the top of his head. I'd have to go count them because there's so many subparagraphs. But then we have pretty good lists of what other states tax service wise. The states that are really smart at tax, lawyers and a lot. Senator Hops is not listening. But we have a list of services that are taxed in Mississippi, services that are taxed elsewhere. We could definitely provide that to the committee as well.
So it's your position, you're advocating putting sales tax on lawyers? Is that what I heard?
Only if it's the committee's wish. But we have some materials I can get to you on services. There's some really good, I think the Tax Foundation has some good publications on what services are taxed where, and it gets pretty complex. Some of the charts get pretty complex, and so I'd be happy to provide it to the committee at some point. Pages 12 and 13 show you kind of where we stack up as far as sales taxes go. According to this chart, Mississippi is number 22. And I think the higher you are, the higher your tax is. And so if you want low taxes, you'd want to be down toward 50. If you want high taxes, you'd want to be number 1.
Well,
So
how's Nevada number 13 and they got an 8.24?
sir? Yeah, because theirs is higher. The higher you go, the higher your tax is. If you want low taxes, you want to be at the bottom of the list.
Well, Nevada's got number 13
Oh.
and they're 8.24 and we're 7.06 and we're number 22.
I'm sorry. Turn to page 13. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, the map was different.
So I think this chart includes both the combined rates. So most states have a combined rate. And so when you look at the combined rate, so like in Louisiana, your state tax rate is 4%. So they score out a lot better than we do. And if you look at the combined rate in Louisiana, the Tax Foundation says it's 10% and our combined rate's 7%. And so we score out better when you consider the local rates. So we don't have, other than your special levies, we don't really have we have 2 municipalities that have a special rate. But other than that, none of our locals have any special rates. And so we score well when you look at the combined state and local rate. We don't score quite as well whenever you look only at the state rate. Are any questions about that? Page 14?
Hey, before you go on, Chris, if I may, I'm back on the sales tax code on page 11. But where are the tobacco and am I missing? I see medical cannabis, the tobacco rate, and do I see Alcohol, is it 7% also?
So retail sales of alcohol are 7%. Retail sales of cigarettes, retail sales are 7%. There's not a special
That's-
rate. Y'all do have an excise tax that you charge is what I
That's
would
all, the
call?
increases are all excise.
Yes,
I
sir.
mean, the higher numbers are all excise. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Both, really, I guess all three: cannabis,
Cannabis-
alcohol, and tobacco.
Cannabis has a separate excise tax. Alcohol has a separate excise tax. Cigarettes have excise tax. Things like 68 cents a pack. It's like 3 cents a cigarette. 3.4 cents a cigarette, but we have charts on all of those if you'd like to see it. So for like the excise tax on cigarettes, I'd say we're on the lower end of excise tax on cigarettes. We're not on the high end on those. Other tobacco products, one of the things y'all don't really tax is vape products. That's something that y'all have had some bills on in the past couple of years. So we have estimates on if you wanted to have a vape tax. We've got estimates on if you wanted to increase the cigarette tax, what that would generate. The alcohol excise tax, I would say we're competitive on the excise taxes on alcohol. But we could provide y'all charts on all of those if you'd like to consider what it would do if you changed any of those. So very quickly, I know we talked about it earlier, page 14, because there's been a lot of talk about grocery taxes. This represents our rough estimate of what grocery taxes are. Grocery taxes fall in the general retail sales tax of 7%. And so taxpayers don't report to us when they report their tax information, how much of their sales are groceries versus how much are other things that aren't groceries. And so if you talk about stores that sell grocery items and non-grocery items, it's very difficult to tell just by looking at a tax return what numbers a retail non-grocery item and what number would be a grocery item. So we've done some work to estimate what the state brings in as far as grocery tax from sales tax and use tax. I personally think our use tax number may be a little low given the growth of the use tax in the last couple of years. But we estimate that the total collections from non-prepared foods to be just shy of $450 million a year. And so if you're talking about cutting that somehow, that's the number you're talking about. If you say we're going to exempt groceries, $400 to $500 million a year that comes into the state, not all that goes to the general fund. But that's the number that you're talking about adjusting if you're going to cut the grocery tax. It's non-prepared foods, which I think they're things that aren't cooked and ready to eat when you buy them, is what I would say. As far as groceries now, there have been a lot of states that have had debates on whether candy bars ought to be included in that and what kind of sugars and things like that. My personal opinion is if y'all are going to exempt that, you ought to consider using the federal definition, because right now, folks who are on certain types of welfare, they don't pay taxes on their non-prepared foods. And so there is a framework for our taxpayers that they know when it's this type of sale that they don't have to tax. And so if y'all are considering doing away with the grocery tax, my recommendation would be to use the federal definition of what's exempt from tax.
Oh,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Talking about prepared foods, would a Subway sandwich not heated be a non-prepared food? I know that pizza, if you don't have it cooked, is a non-prepared food.
Yeah.
Well, how do you define that?
I'm sure there are lots of errors, but I think it's anything. So I think a rotisserie chicken, this is Chris talking, and it depends on how you write the code, but we could get you more information on how the federal government's looked at it. If it's a rotisserie chicken that comes in a bag that's already cooked, I would say that's probably a prepared food. If it's one that you got to take home and cook, I would say that's probably a non-prepared food. And there are regulations, federal regulations on what counts and what does not count. We could try to get that for you. And of course, it would all boil down to how y'all write the bill. And hopefully a Subway sandwich is a prepared food. Are you talking about from Subway or from the grocery store? Yeah, I know there's some you can buy at the grocery store that are ready to eat. I would think that's probably a prepared food.
But if you don't cook it, is it prepared?
Yeah. And I don't know the answer to that. I am not an expert on grocery, what the federal government considers. We'd be happy to get you some information on that if y'all are
Please
considering
do.
a bill.
I would appreciate that.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Other questions? All right.
So the next page is the use tax. I did want to spend a couple more seconds talking about the use tax because it's grown so much. This chart shows everywhere that we sent use tax dollars last year. So last year, we transferred $888 million. We're approaching $900 million a year in use tax. And the very next page kind of shows you where we've come from, page 16. So in FY 2016, we had about $300 million in use tax that we transferred to the general fund and special funds. And this year, it was almost $900 million. And so you can really see with the numbers how much that has grown. The chart at the bottom shows you what goes to the general fund versus what goes to special funds. And so while the number doesn't look large on our general fund, you can see the green part has grown. That's what y'all have sent to special funds over the years. And so it's grown to really half of what we collect goes to special funds, really more than half. And most, as I mentioned earlier, most of that is due to the Supreme Court Wayfair decision. I didn't mention that earlier, but the Supreme Court in 2018, 2019 issued an opinion that said, the United States Supreme Court, that said you don't have to have a physical presence in the state. You can have an economic presence in a state and have to pay sales tax in the state or use tax in the state. That event, plus you all passing the Marketplace Facilitator Act back in 2020, it went into effect July 1st, 2020. Those two things really have caused the increase in our use tax over the last years. Briefly, page 17, income taxes. Well, I think we already covered what the tax reform has done. The last two rounds of tax reform has done to income tax. What I'd like to just leave y'all with income tax is, pretty much all of the income tax we collect goes to the general fund. It doesn't have a lot of diversions like the sales tax. It does, most of it go to the general fund, with the exception of some of the credit programs that we end up diverting some of the income tax from. Corporate is the same way, except for what we pay back in refunds to folks. All of that money goes pretty much to the general fund. The next page, page 18, shows you who pays the income tax. There are a lot of numbers on this page. This page is intended to show you at which income brackets most of the income tax is paid. And so the blue chart represents dollars paid for those income brackets. So like the 100,000 to 200,000 range, they pay $574 million, which is about 12.6% of the income tax. And so if you just did some math on these, we've got it spelled out at the bottom. 87.25% of individual income tax is paid by those making over 50,000 annually. 65% is paid by those making over $100,000 annually. '19 and '20 are the tax reform items I covered earlier. I'd be happy to answer any questions y'all have about those. And in page 21, now this is not my chart, but I did pick it up just because it does show you kind of where the states have been going. There's been a lot of national news about income tax. A lot of states have done some income tax reductions over the last couple of years. And this chart, I think, does a pretty good job of showing you where states are and where they're going. I believe Arkansas may have had a bill passed since this chart was put out. And so I think they're going from you could draw an arrow out to the side. They're going from 4.4, I think, to 3.9. I think that bill's already passed. And so this is not completely up to date. And this is not our report, but I did think it was useful as far as showing you kind of where the states are going. And then the next chart shows you some corporate tax, franchise tax, income tax information. I like this chart just because it shows you which industries are really paying our income tax, how many taxpayers we have in each industry. Shows you a little bit about the corporate income tax credits as well. Jan would be happy to answer any questions you have about these tax credits. And we also have a list of tax credits on page 23. This is the chart I mentioned earlier that we can get for you that breaks it down by tax type that the income tax credits apply to. Because not all of those are tied directly to income tax.
Say it again.
Not all of these tax credits, not all of these are directly tied to income tax. But I have a better chart that shows you, it was just hard to get all the information on one page. I can provide you a chart that shows you out of these credit types, which tax they apply to.
On the credits, you have any of those listed that expire at a certain period that are time limited?
Are you talking about with a repealer type?
Yeah, any of them that have a sunset?
We probably do. I don't have it with me.
Okay. Just, yeah, I'd like to take a look at which ones, and they may all have a repeal.
I think
or
most of them,
sunset.
I would say a majority of them have repeals in them. Would you say majority? We don't know if it's a majority or not. We can get you that information.
Yeah, if you get a few minutes, if you could pull that together for us to look at.
Okay.
Give us just a minute to digest this, if you would.
I was trying to move through credits very quickly, sir.
What's that?
I was trying to move through credits fairly quickly.
Yeah, I know. Well, we can certainly come back to it. I'm going to open it. We'll open it to the floor for questions here in a minute, but. All right, Senator Blackman, you have a question on that?
Well, my question goes back to when we were talking about the grocery tax. If we were to adjust it, bring it down, or eliminate it, is there a way for that to be done that does not have a negative effect on municipalities' collections?
That question, I can try to answer that question. I think it depends. I'm sorry, a minute.
No, go ahead.
I think it depends on how you write the bill. You could include language that tries to keep the municipalities whole. You could change the diversion percentage that goes to municipalities. One concern I've heard from some municipalities is it's hard, like I said, it's hard for us to estimate. It's easy for us to estimate on a statewide basis kind of what the grocery tax is, but when you get into the granular detail of municipality A versus municipality B, their mixes are going to be different because their taxpayer mixes are going to be different. And it could vary from year to year as well. And so there are some challenges, I think, in trying to make sure that if you just simply increase the diversion, that's going to make the municipalities whole, because each municipality, I think, is pretty unique. And we don't have the ability, I think, to go into each municipality and say, okay, even though it's $450 million a year, give or take, 50 million, each municipality's number could be different because the mix of their taxpayers are going to be different.
Thank you.
So if I may just expound on that, or go ahead, Senator Polk, I'll ask my question. Well, if your municipality is largely reliant upon, if it's a small, rural area, largely reliant upon the local grocery store for its sales tax, the net effect is they would get hurt more than that broad-based municipality that's got many other.
They very well could. And it's hard. I think it's very difficult to get down into that granular amount of detail because we don't collect enough detail about individual taxpayers because they're paying at the 7% rate. We don't have a breakdown on an individual taxpayer basis to give us an exact number. So there is a margin of error and a possible margin of harm that you could have municipalities struggle with.
Okay, Senator Polk.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. All right, I'm confused now. I thought, let's say we were in Bassville, Mississippi, and there was a Dollar General, and they sold some groceries, and the taxes on those groceries show up. And if we eliminated the 7% tax, those grocery sales tax would go away. The city, I thought, got exactly what they collected. as far as the percent of the 7%. Do they not? Do they just take a pool and divide it? I'm confused.
If I understand what you're asking, so when you go into the Dollar General, you may buy some paper towels, you may buy some non-prepared foods, and then you may buy some other cleaning supplies. All of that information, when the Dollar General files a tax return, is in one line. They don't break out, we sold 200 Subway sandwiches. We just get a number. We know the Dollar General paid $10,000 in tax last year. We don't have any detail in those tax returns because all of that is subject to the same rate of tax, which is a 7% general retail rate of tax. And so we've made some estimates based on some studies, but we've done that kind of statewide. And so we know statewide, using NAICS codes and things like that, how many Dollar Generals do we have? How many Walmarts do we have? How many other general merchandise stores do we have, that some that sell things that would be exempt, some that don't? And so we've made some estimates based on those numbers. And so if you have we've made one estimate based statewide, and if you have one municipality that relies, let's just say they have a grocery store and they don't sell a lot of non-prepared food items, they might be hurt a little bit more than, say, a place that has a really broad base that sells a whole lot of things that are not going to be exempt. And so you may hit a smaller municipality harder if they have a more reliant basis on the groceries, if that makes sense.
But a city gets a percent back from the state of the 7% that's sold in that city.
Yes, sir. If they sold 10,000, if the total tax paid was 10,000, they get 18.5% within that city. Yes, sir.
Mr. Sparks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The settlement period for that, just kind of jumping on the question, when do you send the diversion back to the city?
There's a delay. So the retailer will collect it in month number 1. In month number 2, the retailer will send it to the Department of Revenue if they follow the law. And then in month number 3, we will divert the money to the locals
So there's
on the sales tax,
2-month lag, basically.
roughly.
Based on the numbers, if I've got this right, about 1.2 billion we currently divert back to cities and counties from the combination of sales tax, use tax, insurance premium, ad valorem, all the different categories. In looking at states around us, we talk a lot about tax policy. Are states around us sending as much money back to cities and counties through the state, or do those other states have local taxing authority?
Jan or Greg I may have to get them to help me with that question. I do know that our surrounding states all have local, like in Louisiana, it's pretty localized. It's very localized in Louisiana. Tennessee, I don't know if their Department of Revenue collects some of their local taxes or if it's collected through the main department.
It looks like on the map, we were surrounded by the number 1, number 2, number 5, number 3,
Yeah.
like some of the highest sales tax states circle us.
And so we have 2 local taxes in Mississippi, two jurisdictions, and then we have all the special levies. And so we collect all of that and do send it to the locals. I don't think Louisiana does it like that. I think Tennessee may collect the Department of Revenue may collect it for, even though the locals enact it, the Department of Revenue still serves as the primary collector. I can check that on our states surrounding us, but I don't have a breakdown of who has their Department of Revenue collect it versus who has to go out and collect their own.
The numbers that I believe for the projection look like 7.6 billion anticipated collections with 7.035 billion appropriated. Does that sound about right?
That sounds right. Yes, sir.
About a $600 million spread.
Yes, sir.
And how much of the income tax going to 4% is yet to be calculated? Assuming that was in full effect today, how much difference is that?
300.
Roughly 300. It's a little more complicated than that because the tax year and the fiscal years don't match up. But the chart that I gave you would, I think, be the best piece of information on that. And so like right now, as far as estimated payments go and withholding, we're withholding at a 4.7. And so this year's collections represent that 4.7, then we have to go to the 4.4 and the 4.0. And so I think the quick answer to your question, there's at least 300 million left and maybe a little bit more because of the overlap of fiscal years.
And how much of the corporate's left?
We were estimating 42 million a year, and I would say you have fiscal years, so you have 25, 26, 27, and 28, I
So
think.
another 168.
Jan says yes. I'm sorry, I can't do the math on my feet.
So approximately 468 million of tax cuts that are on the books that have yet to take full effect.
Depending on when you start adding and stop adding, I'd be happy to kind of sit down and try to map that out by month. But if you're talking about years, I think that's about right.
And I'm trying to ballpark. I'm not trying to say
Yeah.
fiscal year versus calendar year. But my point is the 600 million anticipated overage we have is barely more than the cuts that are already on the books.
Assuming everything remains static, yes, sir, absolutely.
And our increase in sales tax, and you did touch on this, and some of this may be more so for the state economists, but the strong rise in sales tax collected would track inflation. So when you go back and you look at 8% inflation for a couple of years, the fact that your sales tax numbers are up is expected. That doesn't mean more goods were consumed. The goods just cost more.
Yeah, I believe that's probably accurate. But I do, and it still is my opinion that at the very beginning of the pandemic, when people's spending power went up because of the free checks that they received, you had a moment in time where you had better buying power.
Sure.
And then inflation caught on because you had better buying power. When inflation came on, you increased sales tax revenue, then wages had to go up, and everything kind of resettles at some point. But yes, I think inflation would definitely inform you as to why the numbers are up as dramatically as they are.
And then for the ad valorem tax at the local level, we talked about tax credits, and I think that's some of the things, what's expiring, what's out there. But in the last couple of years, some of these tax credits have been either or, because a lot of the tax credits were based on if you owed an income tax
Right.
to the state of Mississippi, but we've also allowed them to take them on ad valorem.
So there have been a couple of limited credits that y'all have tweaked in the last couple of years where you can choose whether to take an income tax deduction or maybe a property tax deduction.
Do we have a breakdown on how much of this ad valorem reimbursement that we're giving to the counties and cities?
I do. It's not in your material
Okay.
today, but I can certainly get it to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Sparks. Senator Berry.
I feel like I may be the only person that doesn't know this, but you mentioned two municipalities that had a special tax. What are those and what cities?
I believe it's the city of Jackson and the city of Tupelo.
Let me go back to something Senator Sparks was hitting at, if my calculations are right. And again, based on the states around us, Louisiana, for instance, 9.56% when you consider their sales tax, local and state. And my guess is that portion over, I think Louisiana, what are they, a flat
4%.
4% and 5% goes to the local. So I'm assuming all of that it stays with the locals, whether it starts at their state Department of Revenue or the equivalent thereof and then goes back. But most of the states that I look at on this chart are somewhere between 5, 6, 7%, other than the states. There are a few that don't have any sales tax. We send about a third of ours, from one of your earlier charts, about a third of our sales tax. So if we're collecting on average, anything over that 7% is going directly to the locals anyway. So out of that 7%, we're sending about a third back to, that's been diverted, municipalities and counties primarily.
Yes,
There may be a little bit motor vehicle or something. No.
Education gets a big chunk.
Education. So roughly, what would that be? 2.3% is being taken out of our effective sales tax rate going to the state because it's going elsewhere.
And
So-
I haven't calculated, but it's some percentage amount you
So
could say
we're-
is basically a local tax that you're just collecting as a
Yeah,
general
We're
sales tax.
keeping about a little over 4%, 4.5% of our sales tax is staying in the state staying with the state that'll go to the general fund for use to be appropriated.
Yeah, some amount. I'm not sure the exact amount, but we could certainly try to calculate that for you.
Okay. I just point that out. It's an interesting fact that we don't talk about a lot. Yeah. Thank you.
We have some questions from Zoom. I think Senator England has a question.
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Hey, Chris, thanks for the presentation. I have a question about, the sales tax and the grocery tax. And just, I know we all know this, but there may be others listening. We don't really have a grocery tax in Mississippi. That's just our 7% sales tax. Is that right?
I think currently grocery items are subject to the regular retail rate of sales tax, which is applicable to all tangible personal property. Yes, sir. That's correct.
Okay. Okay. So my question is with regard to vendors and stores. If we were to reduce taxes on groceries, and for instance, when I go to the cash register, my taxes are applied right there. Is that something that vendors and stores are able to do, or do you guys work with them on which specific items they're able to apply a different tax to? Is that something if we just mess with the grocery tax, are we going to be costing our stores and our vendors a bunch of money on new software or anything like that?
I think anytime you change the tax code and change the way things are done, there's a cost. I can't tell you what that cost is. There's always there's a cost to the state. There's going to be a cost to the vendors as well. We do currently. I showed up, and I'm sorry I didn't have my. I don't know that you got a copy of the handouts. I did have a chart that showed the different rates, and so we already do in the state of Mississippi have numerous rates. Some things are 7%, some things are 1%, 3.5%, 1.5%. And so we do have a framework for doing that. I can also tell you that currently those who are selling grocery items, if they sell to have the little signs that say EBT accepted here, they already know how to sell a grocery item and not charge sales tax. I'm not saying that makes it easier, but there is a framework for it. So we're not reinventing the wheel if you all decide to do it. It can be done.
Okay, thank you. That answers my question. I don't have a copy of the materials yet, so I will be getting those, but I can almost read it over Senator Polk's shoulder. It's so big a print that it's really easy for me to take care of there.
Thank you. Senator Simmons, he's got his camera working. Apparently he took a shower and put a suit on, unlike Senator England. Senator Simmons has a question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And Chris, I think you may have responded to this in the questions that were raised by Senator Blackman, and then also the exchange you had with Senator Sparks. And it may be in the materials, but is it a way for us to see the 18.5% diversion by city? Of course, show the total that we are collecting as far as the diversion, but then also to show that amount by city. And then if you could try to show, if you could, based upon the actual, because I understand that the filers, the business tax filers in a particular local municipality, that is how the amount of the 7% sales tax is being reported as it relates to the groceries. Is that correct?
The first part of your question, we do have that information on our website. It's in our annual report. It shows what each municipality receives in diversions related to the sales tax. And so we have a very long report section in our annual report.
Okay.
And as far as getting down to a granular level, this may not be what you asked, and I apologize. As far as getting down to a granular level in an individual municipality, I think that would be very difficult, if not impossible, to see. If that was the second part of your question, I'm sorry if I misunderstood what you were asking.
Yeah, I guess the second part is it a way to figure out in each municipality in the state what the impact of eliminating the 7% sales tax on grocery would be?
I think it would be very difficult to get it to a level that you could rely on it 100%. Very difficult, because it's such granular level detail, and it'd be very, I think, very difficult to say, hey, this is your number. I think from a state level, it's pretty easy to estimate what the number is. But on an individual municipality level, I think it'd be very difficult to get it and have any confidence that it's actually correct.
Okay. And when you say it's on a state level, would the state level include the sum of the 7% sales tax on groceries that's collected at each municipality? Would that be part of the state total?
It would definitely include the big number. Now, is it broken out by municipality? Not always, no.
Okay.
There is some estimation that goes into creating that number that I think makes it inherently, because we don't collect the data. And so if you had the data, because we don't have the state does not have a separate rate code for, hey, this is groceries. It's all lumped into the 7%. And so getting it down to that granular level is very difficult.
I got you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would, under the grocery tax issue, first you would have to identify what items qualify as non-taxable grocery items. Correct?
Correct.
And then identify, then you would be able to go and I guess figure out how many grocery stores are quote in the municipality or how many are in the county. They don't qualify, or they wouldn't serve as an impact to those municipalities, but figuring out what the quantity of groceries that are identified as groceries as part of that sales tax number. I mean, that's ultimately what you'd have to do. I mean, would it be just consisting of having to create a code for food that is non-taxed?
Yes, and I think the difficulty in doing that is you have a general merchandise store that sells things that are food and they're not food, and knowing that that particular store is a big grocery item store versus a similar store in another municipality that may not be as strong on the grocery side of things. So you really get into information the department does not have on an individual store basis. And so while it may be, like a chain, you may be able to make some general deductions on an individual store basis. That gets very difficult because you don't know. One store may have a great plate lunch and they sell the heck out of plate lunches, and then another similar, say, convenience store may sell more non-prepared items. And so that's going to affect your number. And without knowing the mix inside a particular store, your number could be off in a particular municipality, I think, pretty hard.
How do grocery stores that are in states that don't have grocery tax and that are also in states that have it or have a sales tax on all of it, how do they differentiate it? I mean, is Kroger set up to have codes on their merchandise that separates it from taxable and non-taxable? Is that?
I believe so, and I believe they do that now with food stamps. And so, yeah, they probably have the information, but the Department of Revenue does not.
Okay. Okay. All right, you carry on.
I would be happy to conclude my presentation at this point or take any other questions that the committee might have. I really only had a couple more slides.
Yeah,
One,
hit on petroleum transfers real quickly. I see that back here.
okay, so page 24 has petroleum transfers. I really just put this slide in. I think what I said about petroleum transfers earlier is the gas tax has stayed fairly level. It has grown a little bit, but not a whole lot. That's because it's based on amount, not price. Our gas tax is fairly low compared to other states. I think we're probably in the bottom 1 or 2 as it relates to gas tax. Bottom two. So our gas tax is fairly low, and because it's not based on price, it doesn't fluctuate with inflation, so it stayed pretty flat. You can see where all we send gas tax. Most of it goes to the Department of Transportation. Outside of that, I did not have a whole lot extra to.
Do we have, this may not be your department, Chris, but any information on the states that have more EVs and hybrids and how the gas tax is hitting I'd love to see if there's enough information, enough data out there nationally to let us know how they're faring. We did put in a hybrid and EV fee assessment for those that don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. To essentially, it makes every user, a gas tax is a user fee really, but we put that in 6 or 7 years ago. But I'd love to see how those things are trending.
Okay.
Because I know we don't have as many gas vehicles, combustible engine vehicles as we once had.
And they're more efficient as well.
Yeah, true.
Whether you're talking about a hybrid or just a more efficient vehicle, we'd be happy to try to put something together on that. I think we can probably.
So the fact is, we're still tearing up the roads more because people are still using their cars, but they just get a lot more miles per gallon, and some are using EVs, which I'm told those vehicles weigh more than combustible engine vehicles too. So.
And when you passed the electric vehicle and the hybrid assessment, y'all also tied that to inflation. And so that one does actually adjust with inflation.
All right. Go ahead. You go ahead.
Real quick, while we're on the topic, as far as any trends, or is there anything with revenue trends that you kind of discovered or you would want to share with the committee on where you think we're headed on any of the, especially the major pots of revenue the state has? Is there any?
I think not much to add from what I said earlier, which is, sales tax this year is really tracking what we did last year, which kind of makes it look like it's the first year in several years that we haven't just been blowing it out of the water on sales tax growth. And so it seems like, at least from that perspective, things are more back to normal, where you might have normal growth from year to year. The income tax number is up a little bit from where we thought it would be this year. It's still, I still think with the tax cuts that are coming, the income tax number will not grow a whole lot. The use tax number, if we were sending all that money to the general fund, it would really be substantial for the state, but it's been very good for the municipalities. And I've heard the municipalities say just from the sales tax number, that's 30 to 40% of their budget. And I imagine the use tax money is really helping them make ends meet as we've seen increased costs. But I do think the use tax number will continue to grow. It has stayed strong and looks strong this year. So that appears people are still buying things online quite a bit, because I think that's the most significant driver of the use tax number. And then I mentioned the insurance premium tax number, which I think will probably, I think our prediction is it'll probably get more back to normal in the next couple of years, but maybe another year before it gets back to a normal growth.
Okay. And then can we get a quick update on the ABC warehouse? I saw the revenues. We were #1 in the country, I think, for growth in that category, but that seems to have leveled off a little bit. And what's the status on the warehouse?
So the Department of Finance and Administration put out an RFP several months ago. A contractor has been selected. It's really a design build team. It was a design build procurement where you select the whole team all at once. And so the entire team is in place. They are finalizing the final design details now. And that's deciding exactly what the material handling equipment is going to be, where all the plugs are going to be, where the wireless routers are going to be, all the real details, the framework of the building, size-wise and everything. They're finalizing all of those details now. I was really hopeful we would have some groundbreaking, some construction started in the next month or two. I think the official schedule is January, February, probably first part of February that they would begin construction. I think we're on calendar to do that. We spent a whole lot of time working on it. It's a lot of details you've got to go through to get the details down on the building. We bought a piece of property, the state did, in the Canton city limits. It's right off the Nissan Parkway. It's in a good location. The operator, I was told, was in favor of leaving it in that area. And I think we're on course to get construction going soon.
How long do they estimate it take to complete construction and have it?
I believe our hope is August of 2026. So it'll take a while to construct.
All right. Any other questions from the committee? Bradford?
Thank you. Do we know what percentage of working Mississippians don't pay any income tax?
Any income tax, we do. I'll have to get that for you if you'd like to see it.
Yeah.
We do.
Thank you.
So that's somebody who does not pay any
Yeah.
income tax. We do have those figures.
Thank you, Senator. Seeing no further questions, thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you all for having us.
And we will probably follow back up with you, given anything happens before the next meeting, may ask y'all to come back and if there are any other questions the committee has, want updates, or any of our colleagues ask us about, we'll share them with you and maybe get a follow-up at the next meeting.
Okay, would be happy to come back. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very
Appreciate it.
much. Now we're going to have our state economist come up. Is everybody good to go? You want to take a? Corey, how long do you think your report's going to be? Okay. All right, let's take a quick 3 or 4 minute break, and if anybody needs to run the restroom or get some water real quick, and then we'll start with state economist. All right, if everybody will take a seat, we'll get started on our next speaker. Corey, if you want to, you can sit down there at the, okay, just make sure that green light's on the, is there a, oh, okay, they got a new microphone over there. Never mind. Okay, yeah, we can hear you. All
Thank
right.
you, so there we go.
All right.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to kind of update on the economy and where we see things headed. Just by way of introduction, I became state economist really about 4 years ago this week, I think. And the past few years have been a very interesting time. It's also been a very challenging time as far as our economic models and well as our models for predicting revenue. But I will proceed with and jump right into where I think we're headed. Get my slide. All right. This is looking at real gross domestic product growth in Mississippi and the U.S. over the last couple of decades. This is right now, this is as far back as the official data go at a state level. From 1998 to 2008, right before the onset of the Great Recession, Mississippi was growing about 2.2% a year. The U.S. economy was growing about 3.2%. Then the Great Recession is, if you're old enough to remember, I'm sure the bottom basically fell out. And we had about a decade where we just did not grow very much at all. We're growing about 0.1% over that period. U.S. growth came down as well, not near as much, about 2.1%. Since 2020, we have rebounded somewhat to about 1.9% growth. U.S. economy has come back to 2.4% growth over that period. If we look at the whole period, basically the last 25 years, Mississippi's economy has grown about 1.4% a year. U.S. economy has grown about 3.2% over that period. But that is historical. Going forward, I think numbers will look different, as I'll get into. This is the annual change in Mississippi real GDP since 2009. I started 2009 because that was the onset of the Great Recession. We contracted 3.7%, and then we had a lot of trouble really getting momentum. We had some growth the next year, but then we contracted slightly, and then we had 2% growth in 2012. And after that, we were below 1% for the next almost 10 years until we got to the pandemic. We contracted, the latest revised number is we contracted 0.8% in 2020, which was a lot better than the national number and other states. We bounced back in 2021 with 4.9% growth in real gross domestic product. That was probably the largest annual growth we had seen since the late 1990s. Then in 2022, we only grew 0.8%. A lot of that was because a lot of the government transfer payments that came during the pandemic ended that year. And then last year, and this is also a newly revised number, that we grew 2.6%, which, as you can see, that is the second highest annual growth we had seen over the last decade or so. Just to show the U.S. by comparison, again, stronger growth during the period after the Great Recession, but still somewhat below what we had seen before that. U.S. economy took a bigger hit in 2020 from the pandemic than the Mississippi economy did. They also had a bigger bounce back in 2021. And then in the past couple of years, we've been around 2.5% to 3% growth. And as we'll get into in a minute, we'll probably see something around that again this year. This is by comparison to change in real gross domestic product by state in 2022. As I mentioned, Mississippi only grew 0.8% that year, as a lot of the government transfer payments had dissipated that year. We were probably around 40th, I think, somewhere like that. We look at 2023. Every state grew in 2023. Pretty strong growth for most states. Mississippi was kind of in the middle last year at around 2.6%. If you notice the states that grew the most in 2023, a lot of them had energy sectors. And so that sector did particularly well last year and was able to pull up growth in many of those states. Looking at personal income, very similar pattern to real gross domestic product. Much slower growth during the during the 20-teens, I guess you would say, in the years after the Great Recession. Then in 2020, when the pandemic hit and federal transfer payments came, we had growth of over 8%. And then in 2021, we had growth over 10%. This is growth not adjusted for inflation either. And of course, we had some inflation factored into that as well. Then in 2022, as I mentioned, that was the year most of the payments ended. So we only had 2.2% growth in personal income. And then in 2023, we had 5.4%. Probably still a little bit elevated rate historically compared to what we have seen. But we had particular growth in wages of around 4.9% last year. That's also a little bit higher than we typically see. And we also had a big increase in dividend, interest, and rent income. I believe most of that was probably coming from higher interest rates. It grew more than 10% last year. And we also had a little bit more growth in transfer payments than we had seen in 2022. U.S. personal income, similar growth, a little bit stronger, obviously, in the years prior to the pandemic. Then in 2020 and 2021, we saw relatively large increases. Then a drop off again in 22 with the factors I've talked about. And then last year, almost 6% income growth, a little bit higher than what we saw in Mississippi, but very similar. Looking at employment, this is payroll employment. Payroll employment is the survey that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does of firms within the state. So a measure of their employees, and it also allows us to look at how much is employed in different sectors. Again, starting from the Great Recession, we had a big drop in employment of 4.5%. And then it was also negative in 2010 and flat in 2011. So we went 3 years without adding any net jobs. Then in most of the 20-teens, we were just under 1% growth. 2015 and 2016, we were at 1.2 and 1.1% payroll employment growth, respectively. That was the first time we'd gotten over 1% payroll employment growth since 1999. And then we had relatively slow growth in 2016 through 2018. Big drop in employment, 4.2% in 2020. That drop was still not as big as the U.S. decrease, as I'll show in a second. Then in 21 and 22, we came back at around 2.5% growth. We recaptured all the jobs we had lost in 2020 in the early part of 2022. Last year, we grew at 1.2%, came back to more typical, but still a little bit elevated growth. And I think, as I'll show later, we'll probably be around 1% growth again this year. U.S. employment growth, again, a similar pattern in 2020, but the decrease was somewhat larger than we saw in Mississippi of 5.8%. And then growth in 21 of around 3%, and in 22 of 4%, and then back down to 2.3% in 2023, which again is a more typical level of employment growth that we see nationally. A little more history on payroll employment in Mississippi. starting from January of 2008. You can see we were on a downward trend during the Great Recession. I believe that was down to about February of 2010. When we hit a bottom there of 1.08 million employees. And we spent really right up until the start of the pandemic, getting back to where we were at the beginning of 2008. Payroll employment was about 500 below where we were. Then the pandemic hit, we had a big drop of just under 50,000, but it came back fairly quickly, as that was due to the nature of that recession, which I don't need to get into. And as I mentioned, we had recovery that had occurred by about February of 2022. We were back above where we were prior to the pandemic and prior to the Great Recession. And as of September, we're at 1.19 million payroll employees in Mississippi, and we've added a little over 30,000 jobs since February of 2020. As I just mentioned, we added a little over 30,000 jobs. We've had 2.6% payroll employment growth since February of 2020 as of September of this year. The leading sectors for growth have been in trade, transportation, and utilities. That's been almost 18,000 of that 30,000 increase. A lot of that has been in wholesale and retail trade employment. A source of growth is also the healthcare and social assistance sector. This is a sector that has shown steady growth since the end of the Great Recession, really. And there was a brief contraction during the pandemic, but that growth seems to have resumed since about 2022. Other growth has been in professional and business services. That encompasses a lot of different types of workers, including temporary workers. Our construction employment has shown a little bit of surprising growth, I think, in the context of a high interest rate environment. But I think also some of the infrastructure legislation that came through Congress is likely influencing that. The manufacturing sector, which is one of our largest employers, we actually recovered all of those jobs, as I said, in 2022 in that sector, I believe. But as interest rates have gone up, we have seen decreases in that employment, and that is somewhat typical that you expect to see in a high interest rate environment. The accommodation and food services sector, that was the sector probably hit the hardest in terms of employment by the pandemic. It has not come back all the way yet, still about 2.2% below its February 2020 level. Also, government employment is somewhat below where it was. That's government across federal, state, and local combined. It has seen some growth, but again, it's still a little bit below where it was. This is an employment comparison of the two major surveys. The payroll employment, which is what I have been talking about, that is the bottom line, the dark green line. As I said, we're about 30,000 jobs ahead of where we were in February of 2020. The top line is the residence employment growth. That is done by the household survey. The difference between the payroll and the residence employment surveys is, as I mentioned, the payroll employment survey is the survey of firms. The resident survey is a survey of households. So what is included in the resident survey that is not included in the payroll survey is agricultural workers. It is self-employed. These are people who live in Mississippi and may work in another state. That's captured in that, whereas the payroll is people who might work in Mississippi but live in another state. I don't know that I would say one of these is better than the other, but I think showing both helps us to get a good picture of the whole job market. We saw a decrease in the residents' employment until about the end of 2022. Then it kind of flatlined. And then interestingly, since about April of this year, we have seen a pretty good tick up in the residents' employment, although the payroll employment has remained relatively flat over that period. The payroll employment, we tend to see a jump, and this just may be the way the surveys are done. I'm not sure how the methodology works there exactly, but we tend to see a jump in the beginning of the year and then relatively flat until the end of the year. But we are still able to see growth in payroll employment. These two surveys kind of diverged somewhat during the pandemic because it was difficult to conduct those surveys at that time. But as you can see over time, they have somewhat converged and gotten closer together. This is the job openings and hires comparison for Mississippi that I've looked at pretty consistently since the pandemic. This comes from what is known as the JOLTS survey, if you've heard of that, the job opening labor turnover. Prior to the pandemic, job openings and hires were pretty close together. But since coming out of the pandemic, there has been quite the separation. The biggest separation came about the middle of 2022. We had probably 30,000 more job openings than we did hires. Job openings have increased a lot more than our hires did. Our hire numbers have come back to about where they were, but we still have what I would say an elevated job openings number compared to where we were prior to the pandemic. There's about 1.5 job openings in Mississippi compared to the number of hire for every hire. You can contrast this with the U.S. Job openings and hires, and you can see that Mississippi's job market is somewhat tighter than the U.S. job market. As of September, the U.S. had about 7.4 job openings, just slightly more than they did in January of 2020 when it was about 7.2. So nationally, job openings have come down, and the hired number has come down as well. It's actually a little bit below where it was at the beginning of 2020. So we have a bit tighter labor market in Mississippi than in the nation right now. And I think that's probably because of it's been more difficult finding workers in Mississippi. This is the employment cost index, the 12-month change. This is a number that is calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's a good measure of how much wages are growing. This particular measure is wages and salaries only. It does not include any benefits, so it's not total compensation, just that wage number. It's very good to look at in terms of, in the context of inflation. As you can see, in the 2 years prior to the pandemic, this number was about 3%. Between 3 and 3.5% is generally considered consistent with 2% annual inflation growth. That is the target of the Fed. During the period of high inflation, we saw this employment cost index go as high as 5.7% year over year. That number has come down. And as of about the third quarter of this year, it's about 3.8%. So it's moving in the right direction as far as where you would like to see it in terms of inflation. Labor force participation rate in Mississippi. This is something I have talked about on a number of occasions in the past year, going back to the Stennis Forum late last year, Senator Sparks' committee earlier this year, Accelerate Mississippi Conference earlier this year, and I spoke to the Early Childhood Development Council last week on this topic. It's been a very, I guess I would say, topic of interest among many individuals in the state. primarily because of where that rate is in relation to the rest of the country. Mississippi has one of, if not the lowest, labor force participation rate among all states. Of course, labor force participation went down during the pandemic. Nationally, that number has gradually trended up. We have seen different movements in different groups in terms of labor force participation nationally. But as of most recently, it's about 0.5 percentage point behind where it was prior to the pandemic. It would probably still be lower than it was prior to the pandemic because of just demographics, the aging of the labor force. You have more baby boom generation entering retirement age. In Mississippi, we had a drop in our labor force participation rate as well. It came back as high as 55.3% in about the second quarter of 2022. That was a full percentage point below where it was. And then for about the next year, that rate came down or trended down. We hit a low of 53.7% earlier this year. But the good news is, since that time, we have seen a increase in that rate to 54.5%. I don't have a good explanation for why that rate trended down for over a year, and I don't have a good explanation for why it has come back up. As far as it coming back up, it could be that, and this coincides with the increase in the residents' employment we have seen over this time as well. There have been some anecdotal reports of a lot of businesses being started in Mississippi in the last several months that may be contributing to that, and that would be consistent with that increase in residents' employment. If we look at what has happened to residents' employment since February of 2020, Mississippi's number of unemployed has fallen more than 50%. This number was actually closer to 55% a few months ago, but it has gotten smaller since then. The employed number, however, has grown much less in this particular survey, only 1.2% or around 15,000 as of September, and much of that growth has come in just recent months. So the end result of that has been our labor force has fallen by almost 2 percentage points. It's actually been a bigger drop than that until recently. And we've also had a small increase in our civilian non-institutional population. So labor force and the population number, the top number has gotten smaller and the bottom number has gotten bigger over the last 2.5 years. That explains why we have seen the decrease in the labor force participation rate, at least in terms of a calculation.
Corey, real quick.
Yeah.
What do you attribute this to? I mean, what do you think is the driving factor, or what is the driving reason why these numbers are? I mean, labor force participation doesn't even take into account people that are just quit looking for jobs that are able-bodied.
That's right.
So what do we think the real labor force participation rate is in this state?
Well, if you added discouraged workers, I mean, I haven't seen a number of discouraged workers in Mississippi. Those people who you mentioned have given up. My estimate would probably be you'd see a labor force participation rate of no more than 50%. It'd probably could even be below 50%, but I would have to find an estimate of what those discouraged workers look like. But that's a big reason why we've seen such a low unemployment rate is people have left the labor force. They haven't, for whatever reason. I don't know exactly what all those reasons are. But that explains the decrease in our unemployment rate and our labor force participation.
Well, I guess if you coincided that with an uptick in enrollment in community colleges and our institutions of higher learning. You could say, well, people are going back to school. People are trying to go finish a degree maybe, or get a certificate in something, or trying to get an associate's degree. Are you seeing any correlation to that transfer of people that are no longer looking for work because they're going back to school? And I mean, I don't know if that can even register as how much of a population that is, but do you see anything like that?
We haven't seen too much in growth in college enrollment that I'm aware of. I mean, we've seen some, but you've also got some population things going on with college enrollment. Coming out of the pandemic, one of the things people thought was we had people retired early, but obviously most of that has already, been accounted for. And population changes may have accounted for some of this. Again, that's kind of just me theorizing what it could be, that people of prime working age, say the 25 to 54-year-old age group, may have left the state. We've had people over 65 move in. That could be one explanation for that, but I don't know for certain.
Okay, thank you.
If we look at the change in payroll employment since February of 2020, Mississippi is kind of in the middle at our 2.6% growth. Better than some of the surrounding states. Louisiana is still has not recovered all the jobs they lost during the pandemic. And then there are other states that have also seen population increases that have had fairly large increases in payroll employment over that time. The residence employment, the other employment survey, Mississippi hasn't seen quite as much employment growth in that. So we're still somewhat in the middle, but a little bit further down. And you have more states that have not recovered based on that particular survey measure. We look at initial unemployment claims in Mississippi. The dotted line is the monthly average in 2019, which was about 5,400. For the most part, we've stayed below that since the end of the pandemic, which is a sign we're not seeing, many layoffs and increases in job losses. We're still just below that most recently. Same story with continued unemployment claims. Dotted line is the 2019 monthly average, which I think was around 38,000. And for the most part, we have stayed below that, although we did see a little bit of a jump last month. U.S. unemployment claims, same two graphs, but you can see those are above the 2019 averages, particularly on the continued unemployment claims. So this is just more evidence that we have a tighter labor market in Mississippi than we do nationally. Building permits, another indicator that I like to look at. Of course, building permits in Mississippi aren't quite as useful as they are in some other states because we have so many rural areas in the counties where building permits are not required, but they still do give us some indication of economic activity. This goes back to January of 2000. Although the housing crisis did not hit Mississippi as hard as it did other states, we still had a big drop off in building permits and housing construction activity that has slowly come back inside the green circle there. That's about when the interest rate increases started. We saw a decrease in that, but it is somewhat stabilized over the past 6 to 12 months. And we've seen a little bit of growth in building permits, which may pick up as interest rates come down. This is the conventional 30-year mortgage rate. The dotted line is the forecast out through, how far out did I go? End of 2026. Mortgage rates have peaked we think at around a little over 7%, although they are still close to 7%, they should be coming down over the next couple of years as interest rates come down, getting back to around 5%. Of course, that will still be much higher than we saw around 2020 prior to the increase in interest rates that was done to combat inflation. This is our annual change in income tax withholdings in Mississippi. It's also been a good economic indicator. This is done on a calendar year basis, not a fiscal year basis, because I'm looking at the implications for the economy. In 2021 and 2022, we had very strong growth, both real and nominal, but especially nominal as people's incomes increased, much above what we had seen in the years prior to that. And then in 2023, as we saw implementation of tax cuts, we saw decreases in that. So that kind of lessens the value at the moment of withholdings as far as the economic indicator. This is a change in inflation that we have seen since January of 2021. This is the change in the consumer price index, which is the most common. Early 2021, we were below 2% year over year. We saw increases by the middle of that year to 5%, and then we peaked, I think, around June of 2022 at a 9.1% year over year increase in the price level. That was the highest rate we'd seen in about 40 years. The Federal Reserve began increasing interest rates in May of 2022. And as they did that, we saw a gradual decrease in the increase in the consumer price index over the next year or so. We got down to 3% year over year increase in May of 2023. But then we didn't see much change over the next year. And then we finally, in about July of this year, we got below 3% year over year change. And so as of September, we're at about 2.4%. That's still a little bit elevated as far as what the Fed would like to see. They would like to get that down to around 2%, but the trend has been in the right direction in the last few months. Core CPI, very similar pattern. Core CPI excludes the food and energy costs. We've seen a gradual decrease in that year over year rate since about the middle of 2022. But the core CPI will be more difficult to get down compared to the overall CPI inflation level because of the cost of housing. Housing continues to, in particular, a lot of large metropolitan areas be one of the major drivers of inflation. And so you've got the core CPI still at 3.3% year over year. As I mentioned, these are particular categories of changes in price level as of September, year over year change. Gasoline and energy prices are down. Food prices are still up, but they are going up at around a 2% rate. New vehicle prices, which had been elevated for the past couple of years, have come down somewhat. Shelter prices, and again, I'm talking about the rate of growth. I'm not talking about the actual price level. Shelter prices are still growing at almost a 5% rate. Again, that is driving much of the overall inflation that we're seeing right now. Another graph I've looked at since the end of the pandemic in terms of inflation has been how much people have spent on goods versus services. Of course, at the height of the pandemic, people were staying at home and they were spending more on goods than they were services. Prior to the pandemic, it was a little over 31%. I got as high as 35% in the middle of 2021. That number has gradually come down, and as of September was at 31.4%. So very close to where it was prior to the pandemic, and that's consistent with a falling level of inflation. So I will wrap up with our forecast, our latest forecast as of October. This is the national economy's forecast for U.S. real GDP done by the firm S&P Global Market Intelligence. They think in 2024, the U.S. economy will grow 2.7%, very similar to what we saw last year following the most recent revisions. We've also looked at the forecast done by Moody's Analytics. They're also looking at 2.7% growth for 2024. Then we expect to see a slowing of the economy, particularly as the labor market growth slows to just over 2.1% in 2025 and then 1.8% in 2026. Mississippi following a similar pattern, but somewhat lower levels of growth. We think 1.8% growth this year, coming off 2.6% last year, and then somewhat smaller growth in 2025 and 2026 as the labor market begins to slow. But again, these look better than what we were seeing in the years following the Great Recession prior to the pandemic. Changes in employment nationally, payroll employment is forecast to grow 1.6% by S&P Global this year. That's pretty typical that what we saw prior to the pandemic. But then as the labor market slows, and this is mostly due, I think, to the overall effects of higher interest rates that we've seen the past 2 years, kind of catching up to employment growth of 0.8% in 2025, and then 0.3 or basically flat employment growth in 2026. Same story in Mississippi. We think we'll have around 0.9 to 1% growth this year, and then a slowing down in 2025 and 2026, more like what we saw prior to the pandemic. In terms of inflation, S&P Global's forecast for the annual change in the CPI this year is 2.8%, somewhat elevated, but much better than what we've seen the last 3 years. And then in 2025, they think we will be down to the Fed's target rate of 2% annual inflation. But then they do think we could see a moderate increase in inflation in 2026 as they attribute this to a tightening of global natural gas supplies. They think could see some increases in energy that would cause a moderate increase in the inflation rate in 2026. So I will summarize the outlook by saying that the U.S. economy is moving from above trend growth that we saw coming out of the pandemic to kind of below trend growth particularly as the labor market cools. Reasons for this have been the higher interest rates, those effects catching up, tighter financial conditions, particularly in terms of credit, the fading effects of fiscal support. Of course, this was not only the CARES Act, American Rescue Plan, but also the infrastructure bill, and other legislation we have seen under the Biden administration. And also another factor will probably be the stronger dollar. That's just because the U.S. economy has done better than pretty much all of the other industrialized economies in the past few years. So our expectation is for slower growth in 2025 and 2026, but no recession. This was sort of the same story I was telling this time last year, but we really didn't slow down that much in 2024. We finally started to see a little bit of slowdown this year. So the so-called soft landing, which you may have heard a lot about in business news, it seems to be very much in play. The soft landing being able to get inflation rate down to so-called normal level without seeing a big increase in unemployment. At least one of the national investment firms, either JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs, has said we've hit the soft landing, but others are saying we seem to be getting there. And as inflation is slowly moving to the Federal Reserve's target, the expectation is that the Federal Reserve will continue to lower interest rates over the next couple of years. They think that the target rate will be around 2.5% to 3%, somewhere in there. They think that is the so-called neutral rate, where interest rates are neither stimulating the economy nor restricting economic activity. And so with that, I will end my presentation and be glad to take any questions.
I've got several questions, but
Okay.
I'll couple of comments. One is, it appears to me, tell me if I'm wrong, that as far as the GDP is concerned, how we've compared to the U.S. traditionally is we've always been behind them, and always when we have a recession, we don't hit it quite as bad. When we have growth, we don't get as much. Is that a pretty?
I would say most recessions, we do get hit harder, but the pandemic recession was somewhat unique because it hit the services sector harder. We don't, because Mississippi is a rural state, we don't have as much of a service sector, that you would see in states with big cities. So us not getting hit harder during the pandemic recession was a little bit unusual.
Okay. I was thinking that we didn't have as hard of a hit in the years when the U.S. economy went up or down. But anyway, my point was, in the 10 years from 09 to 19, as we compare relative to the U.S., we really didn't do as well during that period. We were relatively few percentage, tenths of a percentage point behind before that. And then since 2020, we've just been a few percentage points behind the U.S. It just appears overall we've taken a harder hit in that 9 to 19 period. That's correct?
Oh, yeah. The Great Recession hit us very hard. And one of the reasons we didn't recover as much is it appears that most of the growth came in large cities. So states with large cities, large metropolitan areas did better during that period than Mississippi did, because we really don't have, a very large metropolitan area outside of the Jackson area.
Mm-hmm. And on the jobs numbers, I want to make sure, based on the charts you showed, both the payroll number of jobs, which I've got down as roughly 1.19 million, and the overall jobs, 1.22 million. That was a peak of all-time jobs on the chart you showed. Is that an all-time peak on number of jobs?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
But I mean, that's kind of what you expect to see in normal economic times. You expect to see your employment numbers continuing to rise.
And that 30,500 jobs since February of 2020, you took a baseline prior to the pandemic and COVID hitting, and since then we've added 30,000. We went down, but now we're back up 30,500 jobs, correct?
Right.
And the labor force participation rate, I think Senator Harkins hit on this too, about the some of the factors there. That number, that percentage of where we are, I did notice there's a slight trend upwards here recently. Do you have any reason to think that's going to either continue to go up some or stabilize or go down? Do you have anything that would indicate where we're going there?
I'm hopeful that it will be able to kind of stabilize closer to where we were prior to the pandemic. I don't think we'll get quite back to where we were, but there was no really good reason for it to come down as low as it did. So I think hopefully we're seeing a trend that'll get us back to closer to where we would expect to be.
Okay, and then finally, on this chart, the higher interest rates. Just recently, we've started to move down on interest rates with both, Fed moving it down. And so I think you trying to, I guess, curb inflation too. But do you think that will help keep it, our growth at a good place, or is that really factored into this at all?
I'm not sure.
Well, I see higher interest rates on your screen, but I'm thinking maybe since you presented this just in the last few weeks, we're seeing slightly lower interest rates. Is that helping?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if the economy slows, that should be conducive to lower inflation. And so the Fed feels confident they can lower interest rates, without worrying about fueling more inflation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Corey. Marks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. and I think this may be in line with what Chairman Hobson was asking, what do you attribute us closing the gap between the US numbers and the Mississippi numbers after 2019? It seemed the spread was much smaller between those two numbers, which would appear we're coming closer to tracking.
Yeah,
United States numbers.
I think the government assistance we got during the pandemic no doubt helped. We've also had a tight labor market coming out of the recession, just like a lot of states did. We handled the pandemic better economically in Mississippi than nationally. So that probably has that's probably one factor in that. We opened the economy back up more quickly. We didn't lose as many jobs. So we've been able to come back more quickly. So I think that's probably the best explanation I have.
And when you factor in the numbers for what you're projecting going forward, there's been 3 major announcements, many others as well, but there's 4,000 jobs in the state of Mississippi that are coming online in the next 24 months. Do you factor that into your numbers, knowing that we have some things that are strategically set up that are pretty significant for a state our size?
I'm not sure how well how those figure into the model. We use the national model from S&P along with our state model, but I expect they are being accounted for somehow in that model.
And then the last thing with, of course, I noticed in 2022, the state of Oklahoma was on the negative side of job creation. In 2023. You mentioned the energy sector. States that have large energy sectors like Oklahoma, Texas, et cetera,
right,
their revenues to a great degree are derived from those subject matters. So you could see ebbs and flows the same way with large, you mentioned it twice a moment ago, metropolitan areas like Tennessee, where you have Nashville, you have Memphis area, and tourism in Florida. Those factors are going to have a completely different economy structure for them and job outlook than the state of Mississippi. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The energy sectors does tend to make the economies of those states more volatile, as you were pointing out with the change in Oklahoma. Now, Texas obviously has a large energy sector, but they're also a much larger and diverse economy, so they don't fluctuate as much because of the energy sector. But yeah, smaller states with energy sectors like West Virginia and Louisiana, they can take big hits when those energy sectors turn down. And the metropolitan areas as well, you talk about, those have driven a lot of growth, particularly in southern states over the last 10, 15 years.
The residents job number, I just want to make sure I understand that. Are you saying those are people who live in Mississippi? That's their residents?
Right.
So we have more people employed that are residents than we show on the non-farm payroll.
Right. And that also includes the self-employed, which are not captured in the payroll employment. But I think what else is captured in there? And agricultural workers, yes, those are captured in there.
But both of those categories would be part of your labor force participation rate, because if you're working for any money during that period of time, you should be counted for the labor force participation rate.
Yes, but that's coming completely out of the resident survey, the labor force participation rate.
All right. And I don't know, I guess I'm just disappointed you didn't attribute the recent uptick in labor force participation rate to the establishment of our Senate Select Committee to study labor force participation. It seems
it's happened so fast, where all the factors are. So yeah, that could be one.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions from the committee? I think our colleagues on Zoom are good. They indicated they don't have any questions. Thank you for coming and presenting to us. If we have any other follow-up questions or need you to participate in another meeting, we'll let you know, but I appreciate
will.
you taking the time.
I do want to note that we're working on a publication about sales and income taxes and different aspects of those that I think will be useful to, hopefully will be useful to legislators. These are characteristics of sales taxes, like you were mentioning, on services, as well as other factors on business inputs that can take away from the efficiency of the sales tax, which I think is something, even if we don't make any more changes to the income tax, we're going to be more reliant on the sales tax because of the cuts we've already made. So I think hopefully we'll have this done by the end of the month, and it will be available for members and the public to take a look at.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We'll look forward to seeing that. All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, we will reconvene probably another meeting, and we'll figure out a date and get it around to the committee to make sure everybody's good with the date. And other than that, this concludes the hearing. Thank y'all.